The silence was the loudest sound on the Vance homestead. It was the sound of air that refused to move, of crops that refused to grow, and of a future that had stalled, choked by the pervasive, unrelenting dust. Elijah Vance, 19 years old but bearing the stoic lines of a man twice his age, woke not to the promise of morning, but to the grinding anxiety of what the day would demand. He lay on his thin pallet, the window of the attic room framing a sun that was already too high, too hot, and too indifferent. It was the summer of 1891 in the Texas Panhandle, a place defined by its promises of endless space and its reality of crushing limitation. He dragged himself up, his bones aching with a weariness that surpassed physical labor. It was the fatigue of futility. The earth outside was not soil. It was powder. It had been nearly 4 months since a rain substantial enough to wet the roots had fallen, and the last hopeful planting of sorghum stood petrified in rows, brittle straw husks waiting for the wind to scatter their defeat. The landscape had been burned down to a monochrome of ochre and gray. Elijah descended the narrow, creaking stairs. The scent of burnt coffee and resentment hung in the air of the kitchen, which also served as the living space. His father, Silas, was already at the table, a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the land they fought. His face, usually ruddy, was now the color of old leather, fissured by deep lines of worry and pride. He hadn't looked at the horizon with hope in years. Now he only looked at it with grim defiance. "Morning," Eli offered, moving to the counter to pour a cup of the thick, bitter brew. Silas grunted, a sound that encompassed greeting, complaint, and judgment all at once. "That mule needs shoeing, Elijah, before noon. The earth may be soft for burying, but it's hard for walking. And don't waste water." "I'll do the shoeing. But Pa, why? The wagon hasn't moved in a week. There's nothing left to haul to town but maybe the dead itself." Silas slammed his heavy, calloused hand on the wooden tabletop. The sound cracked through the quiet like a whip. "Don't speak of that. This land," he paused, his eyes sweeping across the bare walls as if seeing the deeds tacked up there. "This land is Vance land. Your grandfather bought it with the last dollar he had after the war. Every inch of it was paid for in sweat, not paper. We'll stand on it until we're dust, and then we'll soak into it." Elijah bit back the retort that sprang to his tongue. "We're already dust, Pa, and soaking in won't pay Mr. Kincaid." The debt was the true master of the Vance farm. Not the weather, not the failing crops, but the interest compounding at the city bank, represented by the impeccably starched and cold figure of Mr. Kincaid. The mortgage, taken out to buy better, newer equipment 5 years ago, equipment now rusting under the endless sun, had become a living predatory entity. Kincaid, the banksman, was due in 3 weeks. His last visit had left Silas trembling with silent rage, and Eli with a sick certainty that they were standing on rented ground. Stepping outside was like walking into a blast furnace. The light was harsh, unfiltered by clouds. Eli felt the fine, reddish-brown dust settle on his skin instantly, clinging like a second layer of clothing. He walked past the main field, kicking idly at the skeletal remains of the sorghum. It felt hollow, a mocking monument to effort. He found the mule, Bess, drooping in the meager shade of the barn. Her eyes were dull. The barn itself was a testament to Silas's decline. Paint peeling, hinges rusted, the roof patched with inconsistent shingles. Eli took the tools from the wall, the cool steel a momentary comfort. He began the slow, familiar process of trimming the mule's hooves. His mind, however, was miles away, not in the dust, but in the glowing promise of the distant rail yard in Abilene. He'd heard the stories. Men were needed. Strong backs, fast hands, men who could work the cranes and lay the new steel arteries that were pumping life and greed into the interior of the country. They paid cash, not promises. They paid weekly. "The railroad takes," Silas had roared when Eli had last mentioned it. "It takes the land, it takes the freight, it takes the spirit of honest men and leaves them working like damn factory dogs." But what did the land give them? It gave them calluses, endless anxiety, and the certainty of a grave dug in their own failing soil. The quiet tyranny wasn't just the labor. It was the insidious belief that they were better than the industrial worker, that their hardship was somehow noble. It was a philosophy that was actively starving them. As Eli hammered the last nail into Bess's shoe, securing the brassy curve of the metal, he thought of Maeve Sullivan. She was the only reason he'd endured the past year. Maeve lived 3 miles down the road, and her family, the Sullivans, were sinking just as surely as the Vances. That evening, Eli walked over. The walk itself was a study in heat haze and desolation. When he arrived, the Sullivan house looked like a ghost ship, the porch swing still, the windows dark. He found Maeve by the well, drawing a bucket of water with slow, weary care. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or comfort. Her beauty was resilience, etched in the determined set of her jaw and the way she held herself against the world. "Eli," she said, her voice dry, "you walk like a man who knows a secret."
Only that I'm tired of the dust being my future. He took the bucket from her, the rope biting into his palm. "Pa got another note. Kincaid's coming on the 17th. That's payday. Or rather, that's the day we realize we have no pay to make." Maeve leaned against the stone lip of the well, her gaze distant. "Papa won't speak of it. He just sits in the dark and polishes his shotgun. Says if anyone tries to take his deed, they'll have to take his life first." Eli shuddered. That was Silas's philosophy too. The toxic pride of the independent farmer. "We can't let that happen, Maeve. We have to be smarter than them. Kincaid doesn't want our blood. He wants our land. And we can't save it by dying on it." "What then?" she asked, turning to face him fully, her brown eyes pleading for a solution neither of them possessed. "What can 2 children, trapped by their father's stubbornness and a few 100 acres of sand, do?" "We leave." The word was a violent explosion in the evening calm. Maeve looked shocked. "Leave? Where?" "Abilene, the rail yard. I'll go. I'll make the money. Maybe I can find a way to buy the mortgage back when the time comes. I can send money." "And what about me? You think my father will let me sit here alone, waiting for a letter?" "No," I admitted, looking down at his worn boots. I was hoping you'd come with me. We don't have to get married tomorrow, but we could go together. We could work. You could get a job at the boarding houses. I heard we can live on what we earn. We can save. We can be free of this waiting." The proposal was desperate, born not of romance, but of pure mutual survival. Maeve didn't laugh or cry. She merely looked at the western horizon, where the sun had left a bloody stripe across the sky, illuminating the endless, empty prairie. This land was their birthright, yet it held them tighter than any jailer. "The quiet tyranny," Maeve murmured, almost to herself. "It's not the hard work, Eli. It's the hope that kills you. The hope that the rain will come tomorrow. The hope that next year's crop will save you. It never does." She walked toward him, the dust muffling her steps. She reached out and touched the side of his face, her thumb tracing a line of grime near his eye. "If you go, Eli, and you write to me, and you tell me you have a roof that doesn't leak, enough food to feel full, then I will find a way to meet you. I can't stand against Papa and the land right now, not both. But you go first. You prove it can be done. You tear out the roots this soil has on your feet." Her refusal to commit fully was a blow, But her promise was a lifeline. 3 weeks, Eli said, his voice husky. The day Kincaid comes, if I'm not here, tell Pa I went to town for supplies. Tell him anything. He walked back, the landscape now swallowed by the moonless night. The silence followed him, heavier now, burdened with decision. As he passed the fields, he reached out, plunging his hand into the dry soil. He felt the fine grit shift, gritty and unyielding. It was the substance of his life, demanding loyalty it had not earned. He pulled his hand out, wiping the red dirt on his worn trousers. For the first time, he didn't feel defeated by the land, but angry at it. He was not born to soak into it. He was born to escape it. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He sat by the small, sputtering oil lamp, pulling out the worn leather pouch he kept under his mattress. Inside were his meager savings, $3.17, hard-won from odd jobs and traded chickens. It was less than a tenth of what he needed for the mortgage, but it was enough for a ticket on the freight line, enough for a week's food in Abilene. He traced the map of the rail lines he had secretly sketched on a scrap of paper, lines of black ink promising movement, speed, and escape, the polar opposite of the still and decaying world outside his window. He knew he was breaking an unspoken covenant with his father, with his dead grandfather, and with the very soil that had been in his family for nearly 30 years. But that soil was no longer a legacy, it was a prison, and the only way to save the Vance name was to abandon the Vance land, at least for a while. The choice was not between good and bad, but between death by slow suffocation and the violent leap into the unknown. He chose the steel sky over the quiet tyranny of the soil. When the sun rose the next morning, Elijah Vance was no longer just a farmer's son. He was a fugitive from the future his ancestors had prescribed for him. The clock was ticking down to Kincaid's arrival, and he had 19 days to cross the dust and reach the promise of the railroad.
Elijah Vance slipped out of the house, not with a bang of finality, but with the squeak of a floorboard under the weight of guilt. It was 3 a.m., and the deep blackness before dawn was the only true comfort the Texas Panhandle offered. The air was cool, the dust settled temporarily by the dew, and the silence was heavy, a familiar blanket that he was now casting off forever. He left a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen table, anchored by a chipped coffee mug. Gone to Clarendon for supplies. Be back soon. It was a flimsy lie, built to buy him 48 hours of head start, before Silas, his father, realized the mule was still in the barn and the last of the salted pork was gone. He knew his father's rage would be monumental, fueled by betrayal, but tempered, he hoped, by the overriding terror of Kincaid's imminent arrival. His pack was light, 2 changes of clothes, a rusty canteen filled with precious well water, a knife, and the leather pouch containing his $3.17, the capital of his new life. He didn't look back at the dark, huddled shape of the homestead. Looking back meant acknowledging the quiet tyranny of the soil had won a piece of him, had rooted him there. He walked east, toward the promise of Abilene, toward the rumor of steel. The first day was pure endurance. Elijah was a farmer's son. He knew how to walk, how to endure the sun, and how to ration water. But the walking felt different now. On the farm, every step was toward a task. The fence line, the well, the shed. Now, every step was a deliberate act of severance, a choice to leave the world of wood and earth for the world of iron and fire. By midday, the heat was ferocious, climbing quickly into the 90s. The dust, disturbed by his boots, rose in lazy red clouds, coating his sweat-slick skin. He saw the spectral outlines of abandoned homesteads, their chimneys standing like broken fingers pointed toward a sky that never delivered. These ruins were the physical manifestation of the despair he had just fled, monuments to the thousands of others who had believed in the noble lie that independence was found only in owning land. He stopped only when the sun bled into the horizon, resting under the minimal shade of a solitary mesquite tree. He chewed on a piece of tough, dried beef, washing it down with a measured mouthful of water. The silence of the night was the same silence he had grown up with, vast, empty, and terrifying. The only difference was that tonight it tasted of freedom.
He thought of Maeve. You tear out the roots this soil has on your feet. Her image was the only thing that gave momentum to his aching legs. He wasn't just running from the Vance's debt. He was running toward the possibility of a life with her, one where their fate wasn't dictated by the whims of rain and bank ledgers. By the third day, the monotony was broken by the first true signs of the Iron Horse's approach. He had walked 35 miles, his pace slowed by exhaustion and the desperate need to conserve energy. He saw them first, the telegraph poles. They stood at rigid, unnatural intervals, marching straight across the rolling plains, utterly indifferent to the contours of the land. They were tall, straight, and scarred, humming faintly with a life that was not organic. Before, he had only seen the poles near the town center. Here they were an army, a spine of communication connecting the distant cities. He touched the rough wood of a pole, feeling the tension in the wire vibrating above his head. It was a tangible link to a world where information traveled faster than a man could walk, where the price of grain in Chicago could be known in Abilene instantly. It was the antithesis of the isolated, information-starved farm life. For 3 days, he had carried the crushing reality of his life. Now he felt the first true whispers of the world to come. As he walked, he began to see other things, the detritus of industrial civilization. Along the path, buried in the dust, were flakes of coal, black and unnatural against the red earth. He found twisted pieces of scrap iron and occasionally the perfectly symmetrical rusted spike of a railroad tie. The land, still hostile and empty, was beginning to cough up the remnants of its conqueror. The sound began subtly, a low, tectonic rumble that Elijah initially dismissed as the faint thunder of a distant storm, but the sky was clear, mercilessly blue. He stopped, holding his breath, listening past the frantic drumming of his own heart. He waited until the wind dipped, and then he heard it again, a low, resonant groan, followed by a rhythmic, metallic clack, clack. It was the pulse of the Iron Horse. He broke into a run despite the burning in his lungs, fueled by sheer adrenaline. He scrambled up the steepest incline he had yet encountered, a dusty, shale-covered ridge known locally as the Widow's Hump. When he reached the crest, he stopped dead, catching his breath in a ragged, involuntary gasp. The sight below him was a revelation. It was the main line, and it was alive. 2 parallel bands of burnished steel, reflecting the harsh sunlight, sliced through the prairie, extending straight east and west to infinity. They were laid on a bed of crushed rock, a stark gray wound across the red face of Texas. And on those tracks, not half a mile away, was the engine. It was immense, a towering black beast of riveted iron and polished brass. It was not moving, but it was breathing. A plume of white steam hissed violently from its side, and the smell? The rich, acrid scent of sulfurous coal smoke, grease, and hot metal was carried to him on the wind, a powerful, intoxicating perfume of power.
This was not a whisper. This was a shout. The power of it overwhelmed the senses. It was loud, demanding, and utterly devoid of the silence that had defined his existence. He watched for a long time, mesmerized. Workers, not dusty farmers in overalls, but men in dark, stained shirts and gloves, swarmed around the locomotive, oiling joints, hammering something into place, moving with a focused speed that bespoke wages tied to the minutes, not the season. The contrast with the Vance farm was devastating. On the farm, they waited on the rain. Here, they manipulated fire and water to their own will. On the farm, failure was silent and slow. Here, motion was guaranteed, relentless, and loud. He began the descent toward the tracks, feeling his heart quicken. The closer he got, the more the complexity of the operation became apparent. This was not just a train. It was a complex system of logistics, engineering, and raw human labor. He reached the ballast, the bed of crushed rock supporting the ties, just as the engine gave a terrifying, visceral shriek of its whistle, a sound that seemed to tear the very air apart. Eli stumbled back, shielding his ears, his body trembling from the unexpected volume. The engineer, a burly man with goggles pushed up onto his forehead, gave a casual wave, clearly having heard the sound 1,000 times. Elijah crossed the tracks, feeling the heat radiating off the steel rails. They felt alien, untouchable. He followed the line west, knowing Abilene was only a few miles further. The atmosphere grew thicker, the landscape transitioning from open prairie to clustered temporary shacks and supply dumps. He began encountering other travelers, not family men in rickety wagons, but single men like himself, walking with grim purpose. Migrants, drifters, veterans, and laborers from every corner of the country, all drawn by the magnetic pull of the rail line. They wore the uniform of the itinerant worker, dusty clothes, worn boots, and a hard, assessing look in their eyes. They barely glanced at Elijah. They were too focused on the economic gravity that was drawing them all toward the hub. As the afternoon wore on, the single rail line multiplied. Side tracks, spurs, and yard tracks began to branch off the main route, creating a monstrous metallic spiderweb. The air now thrummed with continuous sound, the dull thud of heavy lumber, the shouting of foremen, the metallic groan of couplings being slammed together, and the ceaseless, percussive pounding of hammers. He was in the industrial frontier now, and it was overwhelming. The air tasted metallic and oily. The very scale of the operation made the Vance homestead feel like a child's toy farm, small and irrelevant. He saw the water tower first, a great wooden sentinel looming over the flat landscape, and then the squat, powerful shape of the roundhouse, the massive, semicircular structure where the great iron horses were housed, serviced, and repaired. Smoke billowed constantly from dozens of vents and chimneys. This was Abilene, or rather, the part of Abilene that mattered. To him, the yards. He paused just outside the perimeter fence, watching the chaos. Flat cars were being loaded with incredible speed, men swinging steel hooks, moving packages and sacks and machinery as if they weighed nothing. This was the efficiency that farming, with its slow, natural rhythms, could never achieve. This was the sheer, brutal power of organized capital and labor. Elijah felt a sudden, profound loneliness. On the farm, he was Silas Vance's son, heir to a dying legacy. Here, he was nothing, just another face, another body, another desperate pair of hands hoping to claim a single dollar from the mountain of wealth being generated. He saw a foreman, a thick man with a waxed mustache and a vest, shouting orders at a group of men who were struggling to maneuver a heavy length of rail. The foreman's voice was hoarse, commanding respect purely through volume and urgency. Elijah tightened his grip on his small bag. He had no skills for this world, only the hard-earned strength and stubbornness of the farm. He knew how to break ground, but not how to build a world. He took a deep breath of the coal-scented air and stepped through a gap in the fence, crossing the invisible line between the agricultural past and the industrial future. The sheer size of the operation made him feel dizzy. Everything was geared toward production, toward movement. There was no poetry here, only physics and economics. He approached a small, makeshift office constructed out of corrugated iron sheets near a busy sidetrack. A sign, roughly painted, read, "Labor Foreman, Inquire Within." He pushed the door open. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. A large man sat behind a cluttered desk, wearing an eye shade and scribbling furiously in a ledger. He didn't look up. "What do you want?" the foreman grunted, not pausing his writing. Elijah swallowed, his throat dry. He suddenly felt the dust of the prairie clinging to him like an insult. He was not dressed for this world. He was a trespasser. "Sir," Elias began, his voice rough, "I'm looking for work, hard work. I'm strong. I can haul, lift, dig, anything you need." The foreman finally looked up, his eyes tiny and sharp, sizing Eli up with a practiced, cynical sweep. He saw the worn clothes, the sun-bleached hair, the lean build, the unmistakable look of a displaced farm boy. He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Another one chewed up by the dirt. You ever handled a crane? You ever driven a spike into solid rock? You ever seen a boiler explode? You know what a rail gang pays, kid? It pays in blisters and early death. I know what the farm pays, Elijah replied, the quiet defiance he inherited from Silas finally surfacing. And that's starvation and debt. I'll take the blister and the dollar. The foreman leaned back, a flicker of something, not respect, but perhaps recognition of desperation in his eyes. He pointed a stubby finger at a corner of the office where a pile of steel ties rested. See those? He asked. They weigh 50 pounds each. You load 20 of those onto that flat car outside by the time the whistle blows, and you get 50 cents. Show me you can work like a factory dog, farm boy, and maybe I'll find a place for you for the week. Elijah didn't hesitate. He dropped his meager pack on the floor, the metallic clang of his canteen hitting the floor, lost in the roar of the yard outside. He stripped off his dusty jacket and walked out into the heat toward the steel ties. The iron was hot under the sun, burning his hands even through his thin gloves. He bent, gripped the first tie, and felt the immense, solid weight of the industrial world settling onto his shoulders. It was a weight far heavier than any bale of hay or sack of grain. But it was different, too. It was a weight he could measure, a burden he could lift, and crucially, a product that had a price. He chose the steel sky, and now the steel sky was demanding payment, not in silent, empty hope, but in raw, measurable labor. The quiet tyranny was replaced by the aggressive, loud freedom of the iron horse. The work had begun.
Silas Vance found the note 2 hours after the sun had climbed high enough to bake the kitchen window glass. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been looking for Elijah. He had lumbered into the barn, the only cool place on the whole damned property, to find Bess the mule standing exactly where she had been the day before, unshoed, unmoved. The silence of the abandoned chore was the first hint of betrayal. The certainty hit him when he returned to the house and saw the mug on the pine table anchoring the scrap of paper. Gone to Clarendon for supplies. Be back soon. Silas read the words, and a sound escaped him, a strangled, guttural sound that was half a cough and half a roar. It was the sound of a man realizing his anchor had cut the rope. He didn't rage immediately. Instead, a cold, slow paralysis seized him, making him see the house not as his home, but as the trap it had become. This old farmhouse, the manse, as his mother had pretentiously called it when they first built it 40 years prior, was the physical manifestation of the Vance legacy. And now, one of the Vances had defected. The manse was a 4-room monument to failed ambition. Built of rough-hewn pine, it was painted a faded, flaking blue that the unforgiving sun was gradually burning back to gray. It stood on a slight rise, dominating the 20-mile view of flat, failing land. The unspoken promise wasn't that the land would sustain them, but that the house would endure, a defiant bastion of private ownership against the tides of nature and debt. Silas walked into the parlor, a room rarely used since his wife had died 5 years ago. It was a stifling place, heavy with the scent of dried lavender and stale air. Here, everything was kept exactly as it had been, the relics of a better time acting as a spiritual shield against the current disaster. He stood before the mantelpiece, above which hung a cracked and faded portrait of his father, Jedediah Vance, in his Union Army blues. Jedediah hadn't fought to free the slaves. He'd fought for the notion of a country where a man could own a piece of it and govern his own affairs. After the war, he had taken his small savings and staked his claim here, on this desolate piece of earth, not because it was rich, but because it was available. "This manse stands, Silas," Jedediah had told him on his deathbed, "because we built it with purpose, not convenience. It is the rock of this family. Don't you ever give up the rock." This was the legacy, not prosperity, but stubborn, agonizing possession. Silas reached up and took down the framed deed. It wasn't the mortgage. It was the original land patent signed by a government official in Austin proclaiming the land legally and irrevocably belonging to Jedediah Vance. He ran a thumb across the heavy parchment, the document so fragile it felt like ash. Elijah's flight felt like a physical attack on this piece of paper. His son had rejected the purpose for convenience, the rock for a handful of quick wages. The rage that had been a slow freeze now became a hot, throbbing ache. He stopped back into the kitchen, snatched the note, and crumbled it in his fist. Clarendon was a lie. Elijah had gone for the rail yards, for the money changers, for the very life Silas had warned against. "He chose the factory," Silas muttered, staring at the empty chair where his boy usually sat. "He chose to be a hired hand, a machine, instead of a lord of his own soil." He needed to check the safe. The safe was sunk into the stone hearth of the manse, the very center of the house. It was where the true burden rested. He lifted the heavy, soot-stained lid and pulled out the second, far more important set of documents, the mortgage notes from Citibank. They were tied with red ribbon, clean, precise, and utterly ruthless. The numbers swam on the page, the figures of principal and compounding interest rising like the dust devil he had seen tearing across the fields yesterday. Date of final payment, the 17th, 11 days from now. Silas hadn't told Elijah the full truth. They didn't just owe interest, they owed the whole sum. Kincaid had invoked the acceleration clause after the second failed harvest, meaning the bank could foreclose on the full amount. Silas knew he had failed his father's legacy not because he was lazy, but because he was proud. He had bought the new equipment thinking he could tame the dust, modernize the operation, and prove the Vance way was the right way. He doubled the debt to save the legacy, and now both were slipping through his fingers. He carried the mortgage papers into the parlor and laid them on the verned velvet tablecloth beside his father's portrait. The contrast was stark, the faded heroism of the past next to the brutal reality of the present. He sat in Jedediah's old armchair, leather cracked and smooth with age, and tried to think. The debt was $900. Elijah, even if he worked for a year in the yards, might clear $300, maybe $400, if he starved himself. It was a futile gesture, an adolescent rebellion disguised as rescue. But Elijah's departure solved a problem. The house was quieter. Silas could think. He needed a plan, and it had to be drastic. His eyes fell on a thick iron poker resting by the hearth, the very poker he had used to heat up the brands for their livestock. It was heavy, satisfyingly weighted. "We'll stand on it until we're dust." The unspoken promise of the manse was simple. "I will stand only if you fight for me." Silas knew he couldn't beat the bank with cash. He had no cash.
but he could fight them with commitment. Kincaid, the bank's man, was a city boy, weak and predictable. He liked clean desks and dry hands. He would not expect violence. A thought, dark and terrible, bloomed in Silas's mind. If Kincaid came and found the house occupied, the deed claimed, and the owner willing to defend his legacy with deadly force, perhaps the bank would delay. Perhaps they would offer a concession. They didn't want the spectacle of bloodshed over 400 acres of drought-stricken land. They wanted a clean, legal transaction. If he was alone, he could afford to be reckless. Elijah's presence would have stayed his hand, forcing him to consider his son's future. But Elijah had chosen his own path, severing his link to the rock. Now, Silas only had the manse to save. He stood up, the chair creaking under his bulk. The first thing to do was secure the boundary. He went to the kitchen and took his wife's old sewing kit, which held a box of brass tacks. Silas climbed the stairs to the attic room, Elijah's room. It was painfully empty. The scent of dust and male sweat lingered. He walked to the attic window, the one that framed the eastern view toward Abilene. He could almost see the dust trails from Elijah's boots miles away, nearing the great steel tracks. He spent the next hour working with grim, meticulous care. He nailed down the windows on the attic level, ensuring every hinge was jammed, every pane sealed shut. Then he moved to the second-floor windows, reinforcing the locks and covering the glass with old burlap sacks to keep out the light and the sight of the decaying fields. The manse began to change. No longer a home, it was transforming into a bunker, a fortress of last stand. The weight of the legacy was becoming a physical defense. Later that afternoon, Silas heard the distant sound of an approaching wagon. He stiffened, gripping the shotgun he had already taken down from the wall. Too early for Kincaid, he peered cautiously through a crack in the burlap covering the parlor window. It was Mrs. O'Malley, the nearest neighbor, whose farm lay 5 miles to the south. She was a stern Irish woman, hardened by the prairie, sitting rigid on the bench of her wagon. Silas reluctantly unbolted the front door. The dry air rushed in. Mrs. O'Malley didn't mince words. "Silas, I saw no tracks from Elijah. My husband, Tim, said he heard the boy was spotted walking east, toward the rail line." I forced his face into a mask of righteous indignation. "Elijah went to Clarendon for feed and supplies. He's taking the time to talk to some men about machinery while he's there. Don't listen to gossip, Martha." Mrs. O'Malley looked past him into the gloom of the barricaded house. She saw the shotgun leaning against the wall, the heavy bolts Silas had recently hammered into the doorframe, and the look in his eyes. Not the look of a worried father, but the glassy stare of a fanatic. She said, "I only came to offer to share what little water we have in the cistern." Her voice dropped, suddenly softer. "Tim thinks we have 6 days before we run dry. We're selling the last cow. We're going north, Silas, to Kansas. There is nothing left here." Silas straightened, puffing out his chest. "We're not leaving. The Vance family doesn't run from the dirt they own. This manse will stand, Martha, long after the rest of you have blown away." Mrs. O'Malley looked up at the faded blue paint and the skeletal porch. She said, "A house doesn't stand, Silas. People make it stand. And you're turning this place into a tomb. Don't wait too long. Don't let the pride be your only inheritance." She turned the wagon sharply and drove away, the faint dust trail she kicked up heading north. Silas watched her go, his jaw clenched. Tomb. She was wrong. She was weak. She had chosen flight, just like Elijah. But he, Silas Vance, would choose the fight. He bolted the door shut again, plunging the manse back into semi-darkness. He walked to the hearth and gently ran his fingers over the original land patent, the unspoken promise. He knew that if Kincaid and his men came on the 17th, they would not find a defeated man ready to sign papers. They would find the final defender of the Vance legacy, fortified by 70 years of impossible pride, standing guard in the dark core of his life.
The manse stood silent, heavy, and hot. It was ready. It was waiting. And the promise that the Vance name would die only when the house fell, was about to be tested.
Elijah Vance walked toward the pile of steel ties, his body still bearing the residual fatigue of 35 miles on foot and 3 nights of thin sleep. The air in the rail yard was a corrosive mixture of heat, coal dust, and the metallic tang of steam, a stark contrast to the clean, dry emptiness of the prairie he had just left. The ground under his worn boots was not dirt, but a crunchy mosaic of cinders and spilled oil. The 20 ties waited for him, dull black rectangles of solid iron. They were the foreman's test, and the 50 cents they represented felt like a king's ransom. He bent, gripping the first tie. The metal, heated by the afternoon sun, scorched his palms even through the thin cotton gloves his mother had sewn for him years ago. He strained, lifting the 50-pound weight, and staggered the 10 feet to the flat car. He didn't lift the tie. He wrestled it, muscling it onto the edge of the car with a grunt. The foreman, whose name Elijah hadn't caught, watched from the corrugated shack entrance, his arms crossed, an unlit cigar jammed between his teeth. He wasn't looking for strength. He was looking for weakness, for the moment the farmer's pride would break and the farm boy would quit. Elijah ran back for the second tie. His mind, trained by years of mindless farm labor, tried to find a rhythm, a way to make the task a sustainable cycle. But there was no rhythm here, only urgency. The rail yard operated on clock time, not sun time. The flat car had to be loaded by the time the next whistle blew, or the entire schedule, the lifeblood of the operation, would be delayed. Clang! The third tie landed, shaking the car. Clang! The fourth. By the 10th tie, Elijah's forearms were screaming. The skin on his hands, hardened by farm tools, was soft compared to the abrasive grain of the rail tie. A searing pain began to bloom between his shoulder blades. Sweat poured off his brow, mixing with the dust and grime to form black streaks that ran down his face and neck. He was breathing through his mouth, sucking in the smoke-heavy air. He paused for a half-second too long by the 12th tie. "Move, Vance," the foreman's voice cut through the yard noise. "They paying you to stand there and contemplate the cosmos, farm boy? Move the steel!" Elijah didn't answer. He couldn't afford the breath. He simply bent and lifted the tie, his knees popping in protest. He thought of Maeve. He forced her image into the central vacancy of his pain, her resolute eyes, the set of her jaw. You tear out the roots. Every piece of iron he lifted felt like a root he was tearing out of the soil of his past. Every searing muscle ache was a step away from the crushing silence of the farm. The work was brutal, but it held a strange, undeniable honesty. On the farm, he had worked for months only to have the sun destroy the payoff. Here, the work was destroying him, but it guaranteed a price. The pain was the penny paid in blood and grit. He managed the 20th tie. His body felt like a single massive bruise encased in a sheath of burning skin. He collapsed against the flat car, his lungs heaving, tasting blood and sulfur. The foreman strolled over, his boots crunching on the cinders. He didn't offer a compliment or a kind word. He merely inspected the load. "Stack crooked," the foreman said, pointing to a tie that was angled slightly off the vertical. "The weight shifts, but it'll hold the coupling." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out 2 quarters. They were clean, heavy, and undeniably real. They were the first non-bartered currency Elijah had earned in months. 50 cents, the foreman stated, dropping the coins into Elijah's sweaty palm. The metal felt warm, almost alive. He had earned 50 cents, and it had cost him nearly everything. The sun was sinking, turning the smoke plume over the roundhouse into a majestic fiery column. Elijah used his water sparingly to wash the worst of the grime from his face, and drank the last of his canteen. He had money, but nowhere to sleep. He walked past the main street of Abilene, which was a startling world of electric lamps,
polished saloon windows and women in bright, impossible dresses. It was the Gilded Age brought to a brutal frontier town, a world utterly incompatible with the manse. He ignored the lure of the town and headed toward the cheap labor district near the tracks. He found a boarding house called The Bunk, run by a gaunt woman named Mrs. Pearl. It was less a house and more a long, drafty shed packed with tiered wooden bunks like a coffin repository. 20 cents a night for the bottom shelf, 15 for the top, Mrs. Pearl rasped, her face tight with perpetual disapproval. Elijah paid his 15 cents for a top bunk, climbing past a snoring anonymous body on the bottom shelf. The mattress was straw, thin and smelling of stale sweat and disinfectant. The noise was constant. Men coughing, shifting, muttering in sleep, the distant, mournful wail of a locomotive whistle.
As he lay there, agonizingly conscious of the dull, systematic ache in every muscle, a man on the bunk next to him stirred. "First day, eh?" The voice was a gravelly rasp. Elijah turned his head slowly. The man was old, perhaps 60, with a face like crumpled parchment and hands like knots of rope. "Is it that obvious?" Eli asked. The old man chuckled, a rattling sound. "The way you hold yourself. You ain't used to the clock. Used to the sun, ain't ya? I see the dust on your boots. You're a harvest casualty." Elijah Vance, from the Panhandle. "Name's Saul," the man said. "Worked the rails since they hit Cheyenne. You just moved from the quiet tyranny to the loud one, son. The soil starves you slow. The iron kills you fast, but it pays the coffin man." Saul offered no comfort, only cold truth. He explained the system. The men were divided into shifting gangs, coal heavers, spike drivers, gandy dancers, loaders. The work was interchangeable, the pay uniform and low. There was no loyalty. If you slowed, you were replaced. "What's your angle, Eli?" Saul asked, pulling a pouch of rough tobacco from under his pillow. "Everyone here is chasing a ghost. A bottle, a wife they ran from, a stake in Alaska. What's your ghost?" "I have a mortgage," Eli admitted, the words sounding absurdly small in the clamorous shed. $900. My father's land." Saul lit his pipe, the sulphurous match briefly illuminating the skepticism in his deep-set eyes. $900? Kid, you'll earn 90 in 6 months if you don't drink or pay for women. That kind of money is owned by the men who sit in those plush offices across town, the ones who own the tracks and the manse you left behind. They don't let a penny get into the hands of a man who earned it. The brutal calculation hit Eli with the force of a physical blow. Saul was right. $900 was an impossible sum. He had believed that sheer hard work, the kind his father celebrated, would be the answer. But industrial work had its own math, a formula designed to keep the laborer perpetually in debt and dependent. "Then I'll save every dollar," Eli said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't drink, I don't gamble. I'm only here until the bank is paid." Saul just let out a puff of smoke. "Good luck, son. Don't let the dream cost you too much of the blood." The next day began before the sun, in a fog of exhaustion. Eli was directed to the coal yard, a hellish landscape of black mounds and grinding machinery. His task was to shovel tons of anthracite coal from the enormous piles into the tender cars of the locomotives. This was a different kind of pain. It was rhythmic, repetitive, and consuming. The coal dust, finer and stickier than the prairie dust, coated his throat, lungs, and eyes. The shovel became an extension of his body, and the goal was only to keep the arc of the coal moving, up, over, and down, never stopping, never resting. The pace was set by a thick, muscled gang boss who used a whistle to signal the start and end of shifts, not the sun. When the whistle blew for lunch, Eli slumped against the side of the tender car, his chest heaving. He opened his pack, taking out the dry biscuits and cold salted pork. The other men didn't speak.
They ate with the same grim efficiency they shoveled with, their eyes dull, focused only on refueling the engine of their bodies for the afternoon shift. There was no camaraderie, only shared suffering. Over the next week, the pattern solidified into a cruel, unyielding routine. Wages, $2 a day, minus 15 cents for the bunk, minus 20 cents for food, $1.65 saved per 24 hours of existence. Cost? Blisters turned to open wounds, then to thick, glossy calluses that felt like foreign objects on his hands. His back developed a permanent, agonizing crick. His cough deepened, the coal dust etching itself into his lungs. He lost weight. His lean farm build became gaunt and wired. He didn't think about the work. He simply executed it. His mind retreated into a quiet, focused space where only the numbers mattered. Day 17, $11.55. Day 14, $23.10. The $900 mortgage seemed to mock him, a distant star that refused to be reached. It would take him 545 days of non-stop labor, provided the rail yard didn't slow down, the work didn't kill him, and he didn't spend a single extra penny. Almost a year and a half of this soul-grinding existence just to pay for the dried-out land his father was prepared to die on. One evening, after the shift ended, he walked past the company's store, its windows glimmering with electric light. Inside were clothes, fresh food, and small luxuries. He saw a man, exhausted but proud, buying a small, shiny brooch for his wife. The sight jolted him. He hadn't bought anything. He hadn't lived anything. Every drop of sweat, every labored breath was being converted into a number in his ledger. His existence was pure sacrifice. He walked past the post office, his feet dragging, and stopped. He needed to write to Maeve, not just to fulfill his promise, but because the isolation was starting to feel toxic. He bought a single sheet of cheap paper and a pencil. Back at the bunk, sitting on his mattress, he began to write, his hand shaking, not from fatigue, but from the attempt to translate the loud, brutal reality of the rail yard back into the polite language of hope. My dearest Maeve, I am in Abilene. I have found work with the railroad. It is difficult work, but it is steady. The money is good, better than the farm, though the cost of living eats most of it. But I'm saving. I'm eating, and the roof does not leak, though it is thin tin. He hesitated, staring at the raw black blisters on his palms. He couldn't tell her about Saul, about the coal dust, or about the foreman who looked at him like he was a disposable tool. He couldn't tell her that he was being paid a penny in blood and grit, and that the bank was the only true winner. He wrote the number 25. This was the lie of the week, designed to reassure her that the impossible was merely difficult. I am strong, and I am focused on the day I can return to you. Remember what we talked about. Be safe. Do not let your father fight their battles for them. There is another life waiting for us out here. Yours always, Eli. He sealed the letter and held it, the paper rough under his calloused hands. The lie felt necessary. He had to embody the hope that the railroad represented, even if the reality was a living hell. He had made a covenant with the steel sky, and that covenant demanded his body and his soul for the sake of the legacy he was trying to save from a distance. Back in the manse, Silas Vance was barricading windows, preparing for a siege based on a legacy of pride. Here in the yards, Elijah Vance was fighting his own siege, a brutal, anonymous war against the forces of capital, hoping to trade his youth for the dollars that could keep the house standing. Both men were sacrificing their lives for the rock, but only one of them understood the true, crushing scale of the enemy they were facing. Eli fell asleep that night to the pounding rhythm of the steam hammer echoing across the yard. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of progress, but to Eli, it was the sound of a hammer. driving spikes into his own life, spike by spike, dollar by impossible dollar.
The offices of Citibank and Trust were a temple of cool, calculated power, entirely divorced from the dust and sweat that generated their profit. Located in a newly constructed brick building on Abilene's main square, the structure was the tallest and most solid edifice in the county, a silent monument to the Gilded Age's central truth. Wealth was built not on labor, but on leverage. On the third floor, inside the private office of the bank's president, the air was perpetually cool, filtered by thick velvet drapes that shut out the glare and the noise of the street. It smelled of polished mahogany, leather, and expensive Cuban cigars. Mr. Alistair Kincaid, the bank's primary field agent, stood before the massive, ornate desk of Mr. Eamon Thorne. Kincaid, usually composed and fastidiously dressed, felt the humidity cling to his linen shirt like a physical pressure. He was a small man, meticulously organized, but now, facing Thorne, he felt reduced to a mere smudge on the landscape. Eamon Thorne was not a local boy who had made good. He was the mogul, a man who had arrived in Texas from Chicago 3 years prior, bringing with him vast, unseen capital and a chilling philosophy of efficiency. He was stout, with a waistcoat stretched tight over a prosperous belly and a perfectly trimmed beard the color of salt and pepper. His eyes, the color of glacial ice, rarely blinked, and they never looked at Kincaid, but always through him, at the columns of numbers Kincaid represented. "Report on the Panhandle consolidation, Kincaid," Thorne commanded, his voice a low, perfectly modulated rumble that seemed to fill the room without effort. Kincaid pulled a sheaf of papers from his leather portfolio, his fingers trembling slightly. "Sir, the acquisition strategy is proceeding ahead of schedule. The drought has created the desired conditions. We have finalized 83% of the land needed for the rail spur's westward right-of-way. The farmers are signing. They are starving, sir. They take the settlement rather than face ruin." Thorne did not nod. He picked up a polished brass letter opener and began to tap it lightly against the desk, the sound a metronomic beat of corporate inevitability. "And the remaining 17%? "A few stubborn holdouts, Mr. Thorne, predictable sentimentality about legacy and the soil. They will fold by the end of the month, except for one." Kincaid hesitated. "The Vance property, the one we discussed, Silas Vance." "Vance," Thorne repeated, the name sounding foreign and insignificant on his tongue. He finally looked at Kincaid, a look of focused, cold annoyance. "The one who has the debt of $900? "Exactly, sir. The debt is trivial to us, but the land, as you know, is critical. The property sits precisely on the planned high ground for the new water reservoir we intend to sell to the city council, the one we are funding to alleviate the drought crisis." Kincaid made air quotes around the last phrase, signaling his awareness of the engineered crisis. "And why is this Vance a problem?" Thorne asked, leaning back in his chair, the gesture suggesting infinite time and patience, though Kincaid knew the opposite was true. "He is unpredictable, sir. He is not negotiating. He has not answered our letters since we invoked the acceleration clause. He sent his son Elijah away under false pretenses, I believe to keep him out of the firing line. Our informant, Mrs. O'Malley, reported that he has barricaded his home. He is treating the foreclosure as an act of war." Thorne stopped tapping the letter opener. He smiled, a thin, unsettling movement of the lips that lacked any warmth. "He's playing a very old game, Kincaid. The game of the rugged individualist, the lord of his own soil. He believes his pride is currency. He believes that if he bleeds, we will be ashamed and retreat. He believes in the virtue of struggle." Thorne paused, the cold amusement leaving his eyes. "We, Mr. Kincaid, are playing a new game. We deal only in paper, leverage, and legal jurisdiction. Virtue is irrelevant. Struggling is inefficient. Thorne then pulled a large, meticulously detailed map from a drawer. It wasn't a surveyor's map. It was an overlay showing not just land, but projected property values, mineral rights, and proposed rail lines. The Vance property, though a tiny speck, was circled in bright red ink. "Look at this land, Kincaid." He traced the map with the point of the letter opener. "It is worthless dirt, but its position is invaluable. By controlling the water source, we control the expansion of this entire sector. By securing this land now, we not only eliminate a local obstruction, but ensure that every future drop of water sold to the city flows through a pipe we own. This is not about the 90 cents on the dollar, Kincaid. This is about establishing absolute structural control." He looked up. "This is the unseen hand, Kincaid. It does not swing a hammer or wield a shovel. It moves papers, and in doing so, it directs the labor of thousands of men, like the very men working in the rail yard right now." The implication was clear. The same system that was creating a job for Elijah Vance was simultaneously foreclosing on his home. The mogul's power was absolute. It reached from the polished office to the dust-choked homestead and to the cindered rail yard. The deadline is the 17th. The legal documents are filed. The judge has approved the writ of possession. I want no violence. Violence creates legal headaches, delays, and poor press. I want a clean, legal transfer. Silas Vance must vacate the premises willingly or be removed with minimal fuss by the sheriff. Kincaid shuffled his feet. "Vance owns a shotgun, sir, and he is clearly unstable. He believes he is defending his life." Thorne smiled again, this time with true malice. "Then you must ensure that his defense is preempted, Kincaid. Send Sheriff Brody. He is in our employ, paid by the rail's security fund, is he not? He can handle a lone, desperate farmer. I want those papers signed and the house secured by sundown on the 17th. Fail, and you will find your services are no longer required by this institution, or any other institution operating within 100 miles of our rail lines. Is that understood?" "Perfectly understood, Mr. Thorne." Kincaid felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He wasn't just a debt collector. He was now tasked with psychological warfare and potential forced removal. His own livelihood depended on destroying the Vance legacy. 2 miles away, in the clamor of the rail yard, Elijah Vance was working a 15-hour shift. The coal dust was a mask, blurring his features into the anonymity of the laborer. His body was a machine, fueled by dry biscuits and the 15 cents he managed to save each night. He was part of a chain gang, using sledgehammers to break up large chunks of coal that had solidified in the cold cars. Boom, crash, sweat. He felt no joy in the work, only a grim, consuming necessity. He was an economic unit, converting physical exertion into dollars. He paused for a momentary break, wiping a stream of black sweat from his eyes. He looked across the vast, chaotic expanse of the yard. Engines hissed, the telegraph wires hummed over his head, and men moved with the hurried desperation of those who knew their time was literally money. Saul, the old railman from the bunk, shuffled past pushing a wheelbarrow heavy with tools. "You look like you saw a ghost, Eli," Saul rasped, taking a drag from his pipe. "I was just thinking about the money, Saul, the $900. I realized it's a joke. It's an impossible number." Saul nodded slowly, the smoke curling around his wrinkled face. "That's the mogul's trick, son. You see the tracks, you see the engines, you see the dollars in your hand, but the real game isn't here." He jabbed the pipe stem toward the east, toward the imposing brick buildings of the town square. "The real power sits in the bank, on the paper. You're trading your life for nickels to pay a debt that's owned by the men who own this entire yard. They set the wage and they set the interest. You can't win the mogul's game by playing his rules a lie. You can only survive it." The word struck Elijah with a crushing clarity.
He was a piece of the engine, helping to fuel the very system that was attempting to devour his father's land. His honest labor, the very thing his father idealized, was simply a mechanism of corporate self-interest. He wasn't saving the farm, he was paying for its funeral. Elijah picked up his sledgehammer, the weight familiar and comforting in its simplicity. If he couldn't beat the system with money, he would have to find a different angle. He had 12 days. 12 days until Kincaid, Sheriff Brody, and the unseen hand of Eamon Thorne arrived to claim the rock. That night, lying in the stent of the bunk, Elijah read the letter he had just received from Maeve. My dearest Eli, your letter came. Thank you for the number. $25 is a fortune. I am so proud of you for having the courage to leave, but you must hurry. Papa is selling the mule and the last of the seed corn for cash. He and your father are talking more now, and it is a dark talk, full of guns and pride. They are preparing for a battle, not a surrender. They believe they can stop the bank with force. You must find a different way to fight them, Eli. They will not stop the bank with a shotgun. Please be careful. The fire you are using to save us might burn you first. Come home or send help. The 17th is nearly here. Yours always, Maeve. Elijah closed his eyes, the image of his barricaded home colliding with the image of Thorne's cold, calculated smile. He had to stop his father from doing something suicidal, but first, he needed more than sweat. He needed leverage. He needed a way to fight the mogul's paper game, and he needed it in 11 days. He felt the heavy, undeniable weight of his $25. It was a monument to his suffering, but worthless against the $900 debt. He needed a plan as drastic and unforgiving as the mogul's own strategy. He would not be the farm boy anymore. He would learn to play the mogul's game, or his family would be destroyed. Back in his cool, quiet office, Eamon Thorne checked his watch. He had wasted 10 minutes on the matter of the Vance farm. He dictated a final note to his secretary. Confirm Sheriff Brody's availability for the 17th. Authorization for $100 to be distributed to him for services rendered. Clean up the mess. The unseen hand had moved. It had set the pieces, and now the clock would handle the rest.
The heat wave broke on the 10th day of Elijah Vance's time in the Abilene rail yard. It did not bring rain, but a chilling, ominous wind from the north that whipped the coal dust into stinging horizontal sheets. The change of weather brought a change in the economic atmosphere, too, sudden and severe. Elijah was deep in the yard, working a 20-foot-high mound of soft black coal, his shovel scraping against the underlying frozen earth. He had worked diligently, obsessively, for 10 straight days. His body was now a lean, efficient engine of labor, but his lungs felt permanently coated in grit, and the pain in his hands had been replaced by a dull, constant throb. He had saved, after expenses, exactly $24.75. His total wealth stood at $28.42, a laughable fraction of the $900 debt. He had 7 days remaining until the 17th. The gang boss, a massive, foul-tempered man named O'Leary, blew his whistle for the midday meal with unusual ferocity, a long, piercing blast that signaled more than just a break. The men dropped their shovels instantly, exhausted, moving toward the single spigot and the open space near the corrugated iron shed where they ate their meager rations. As they gathered, leaning against the cold flat cars, O'Leary stood on an upturned wooden crate, his arms crossed over his vest. He did not look like a man about to announce a pleasant surprise. "Listen up, you factory dogs." O'Leary's voice was hoarse, amplified by the cold, dense air. "Mr. Thorne and the directors have decided, due to an unexpected downturn in freight traffic and the general economic outlook, we are implementing an austerity measure, effective immediately." A low, collective growl rippled through the 100 men gathered. They knew what austerity meant. Your daily wage, currently $2, will be cut by 25%, effective immediately. $1.50 a day. You have until the end of the day to decide if you accept the new terms. If you don't, there are 50 men waiting on the other side of that fence who will. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, far more terrifying than the cacophony of the yard. For a man earning $2, the cut of 50 cents meant the difference between a bowl of watery soup and starvation, between a bunk and the open, frozen ground. It meant that the money he was sending home would no longer even cover the cost of a coffin. A man near the front, a spike driver with a massive frame and the name Jesse stitched on his shirt, took a step forward. "We can't live on $1.50, O'Leary. After the bunk and your company store, we'll be paying you to work." "That's the mogul's math, not mine, Jesse," O'Leary roared back. "You talk to the bank, not me. Your alternative is the road, and you know what that means in this weather." Suddenly, Saul, the old railman who had befriended Elijah, stepped out from the crowd. His face, usually a map of cheerful cynicism, was dark with a profound, terrifying anger. "The bank," Saul repeated, spitting the word out like a chunk of coal. "Mr. Thorne isn't losing money, O'Leary. The new Chicago line stock is up 20 points. He's taking 50 cents from every man here to pay for his new summer home in Newport. He sees us as a commodity to be exploited, not men who breathe." Saul raised his arm, pointing toward the bank buildings in the distance. "The man who owns the tracks is cutting your pay right when the weather turns cold. Why? Because desperation makes for cheap labor. He knows that 50 cents will break the back of every family man here, but he doesn't care. It's the unseen hand, boys, reaching out of his damn office to pick your pockets." The energy shifted from fear to fury. Elijah, standing near Saul, felt the collective rage vibrating through the ground. These men were veterans of the Industrial War, and they knew this was an intentional, calculated provocation. "We strike," Jesse yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "We shut the whole thing down. We demand the $2, and we demand a guarantee of no reprisal." The chant was taken up instantly. "Strike! Strike! $2 or nothing!" The movement was unified, powerful, and utterly terrifying to Elijah. He gripped the handle of his shovel, his heart hammering in his chest. A strike meant no work. No work meant no money. No money meant the $900 deadline, now only 7 days away, would rush upon him with devastating speed. Saul turned to Elijah, his eyes blazing. "You hear that, Eli? This is the one true weapon the mogul fears: solidarity. You join us, son. You stand with the men who are starving right next to you, not with the man who's starving your family, far away." Elijah's mind was in a dizzying spin. The philosophy his father revered, the independence of the working man, was now being tested. His father believed in the virtue of struggle, but here the struggle was collective. If he worked, he was a scab, betraying the very men who shared his fate. If he struck, he sacrificed his only chance to save the manse. "Saul, I can't," stammered Elijah, the words tasting like ash. "I have 7 days. If I miss 1 day's pay, I won't even have enough for the ticket back home. My father will die for that land." "And if you betray these men, you might die here first," Saul countered, his voice sharp. "When the strike begins, the line is drawn. You are either a man or you are a mouse for Thorne's cat. Choose, Eli, now."
O'Leary was already retreating to his shack, shouting into a telephone. Within minutes, a squad of heavily armed, uniformed men, the rail yard's private security, emerged from the roundhouse. They were hired thugs, not lawmen, and their loyalty was bought and paid for by Thorne. The strike was immediate. Shovels were dropped, hammers were silenced. The massive, complex machine of the rail yard ground to a complete, unnatural halt. The only sounds were the hiss of steam from cooling engines and the angry, desperate shouts of the striking men. That night, the bunk was a cauldron of anxiety and bravado. Elijah lay on his straw mattress, unable to sleep, acutely aware of his isolation. He had mumbled his commitment to Saul, but he hadn't fully stopped working until the guards had physically forced the laborers off the site. He still had his $28.42, but the strike meant the end of his daily accumulation. He had lost his primary means of fighting the debt. The atmosphere in the barracks was thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and fear. The older men tried to organize, discussing picket lines and demands. The younger men mostly worried about the cold and the hunger. The kettles were empty tonight. No one had food to share. The company store, of course, was closed. Around midnight, Saul climbed up to Elijah's bunk. He sat heavily on the edge, making the thin mattress groan. "You're still here," Saul said, nodding slowly. "Good. Didn't run off to be a scab yet." "I'm not a scab, Saul. I just need to get home," Elijah whispered, pulling the thin blanket tighter around himself. "My father is waiting for a remittance, the money I was saving. If I don't show up with something, anything, by the 17th, he's going to make a suicidal stand against the sheriff." Saul nodded, his eyes sympathetic but hard. "I believe you, son. But let me tell you about Mr. Thorne's game. This strike is his second move. The first was the drought. The second was the wage cut. He wants us to strike. Why? Because while the yard sits idle, his rail spur is being built on the land he already owns. He can wait us out. He's rich enough to starve us all into submission. And when he wins, the wage will be lower than $1.50. Saul leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratory rasp. "There are two kinds of men here now, Eli. The strikers, who will suffer and win nothing but a quick beatdown from the guards, and the rats. Thorne has put the word out. Any man who breaks the strike line will be paid double wages for the duration plus a bounty. He needs to move that coal, Eli. He needs to look strong for the Chicago investors. He's dangling a fortune." Elijah felt a sharp, sickening twist in his gut. Double wages? $4 a day? That meant he could earn $28 in the next 7 days, maybe more with the bounty. It still wasn't $900, but it was enough to buy him passage back to the Panhandle and bring a few dollars of tangible cash to his father, a desperate token that might prevent Silas from shooting Sheriff Brody. "He's tempting us to commit an unforgivable sin against labor," Saul continued, reading Elijah's thoughts. "Cross that line, and no working man in America will ever trust you again. You'll be branded a rat forever. You'll eat alone, and you'll sleep alone." "But Saul, my father, my family, this is my only way back. I don't care about the politics. I only care about the rock." "The rock is the politics, Eli. The rock is exactly what Thorne wants. Your land is the key to his whole water scheme. He doesn't want it for the dirt. He wants it for the leverage. You don't fight the mogul with pride, and you don't fight him with nickels. You fight him with the strength of the many, or with a very clever scheme." Saul left as quietly as he came, leaving Elijah suspended between two impossible choices: loyalty to the workers who shared his poverty, or loyalty to the memory of his father and the manse. Alistair Kincaid, however, was having a much better night. He was in his office at the Citibank and Trust, now functioning as the central command post for the strike-breaking effort. He sat across from Sheriff Brody, a man of enormous girth and minimal conscience, who was busy chewing on a chicken leg. "The strike is holding solid, Mr. Kincaid," Brody reported, wiping grease on his sleeve. "They're disciplined. They know they're being played, but they're too hungry to risk moving the family." "Excellent," Kincaid replied, pushing a stack of crisp new banknotes across the desk. "This is the first installment for your men. Thorne's strategy is working perfectly. The wage cut served its purpose. Now we wait 2 days until they are truly hungry, and then we introduce the solution." "The scabs?" "Not scabs, Sheriff. Independent contractors. We need muscle. We need men who have no allegiance to the rail yard. Men who are only interested in a quick payday. Drifters, veterans, desperate farmers. We will announce a recruitment drive. Double wages, cash paid daily, no questions asked." Kincaid tapped a sheaf of legal papers. "And if any of the strikers try to interfere with the movement of goods or our new contractors, you, as the representative of the law, will arrest them for obstruction of commerce, unlawful assembly, and property damage. Thorne wants this done legally, Sheriff. The law is the mogul's most powerful tool." Brody grunted, pocketing the cash. "It'll be rough. Saul, that old fool, is organizing a tight perimeter. They won't let any man cross without a fight." Kincaid smiled thinly. "Then you ensure the consequences of that fight fall squarely on their shoulders, Sheriff. Thorne is concerned only with the bottom line. The rail spur construction must continue, and the Vance land must be secured on the 17th. He does not wish for the strike to distract us from the primary acquisition." On the morning of the second day of the strike, the biting cold had intensified, and the hunger had begun its slow, painful march through the bunk. The air was tense, brittle. Elijah was sitting outside the barracks, bundled in his threadbare jacket, contemplating his 2 remaining options. 1, strike. Stand with Saul and the men, waiting for the mogul to blink, inevitably missing the deadline. 2, scab. Cross the picket line for double pay, earn enough to get home, and live forever with the shame of betrayal. He pulled out his money, $4 bills and 42 cents in coin. 4 days to travel back home, 3 days left to earn. He needed at least $10 to guarantee his ticket and a small amount of cash for his father. At the strike rate, he had already failed. He stood up, his mind numb. He walked toward the main gate, where the strikers, shivering but resolute, had formed a tight perimeter. Saul was there, directing the men, his face gaunt but his spirit unbroken. "Where are you going, Eli?" Saul asked, his eyes narrowing. "I'm going to find the recruitment post. I'm going to cross the line." The men around Saul stiffened, their anger palpable. Jesse stepped forward, his massive form blocking the path. "You walk across that line, farm boy, and you will never walk in this town again. You will starve alone." "I'm already starving alone," Elijah shot back, his voice thick with pain and desperation. "My family is about to lose everything because a man in an office moved a number on a ledger. I am fighting their game, not yours. I'm going home to save the rock, and if that means I'm a rat to you, then so be it. Saul put a calming hand on Jesse's shoulder. Let him go, Jesse. He made his choice. Elijah faced Saul, the shame searing him. I'll pay you back, Saul. I swear it. You can't pay for your soul, Eli, Saul said, his voice flat with disappointment. But go and learn what the mogul truly demands for his dollars. Elijah walked past Jesse, who spat on the ground near his boots, and headed toward the main street. He found the recruitment post, set up not by the railroad, but by the City Bank and Trust, a subtle indication of the mogul's direct involvement. A banner promised immediate work, $4 per day, cash only. He signed the paper without reading it. He took a heavy pick and a new thick pair of gloves. You're on the night shift, Vance, the hiring agent, a small man with shifty eyes, told him. No contact with the strikers. You work where you told, and you keep your mouth shut. Elijah didn't return to the bunk. He went to a cheap, tiny diner, splurging on a hot bowl of bean soup and bread, shoveling the food down with the hunger of 2 days. The warmth felt like a betrayal. That evening, as the moon rose cold and high, Elijah Vance walked back into the silent, frozen rail yard with a group of other desperate men, out-of-work cowboys, transients, and men whose faces were blank with the absence of hope. They were led by Brody's deputies, who were armed with rifles. Elijah was directed to the roundhouse, where the locomotives sat like dead beasts. His job? Stoke the boilers of the massive, unmoving engines to keep the water from freezing, a tedious, solitary task that involved carrying heavy buckets of coal and watching the pressure gauge. The silence of the strike was absolute here, broken only by the rhythmic clang of his shovel and the occasional nervous cough of the deputy guarding the entrance. He was earning $4 a day, but the metallic taste of betrayal was stronger than the steam. He was the mogul's pawn, a temporary rat hired to break the will of the many, all to save a piece of worthless dirt his father was willing to die for. He was exchanging his soul for the rock. As the morning light touched the roundhouse windows, illuminating the rising steam, Elijah received his 4 silver dollars, heavy, cold, and clean. $32.42 total. He had 3 more days to work, 3 more shifts of $4 each. That would bring him up to $44.42, enough for the train ticket, enough for food, and enough to give his father a small cushion of cash to prevent the imminent tragedy. He felt no triumph, but only a deep, profound emptiness. He had abandoned his labor brothers to save the rock, and in doing so, he had become a tool of the unseen hand. He had learned the mogul's terrible lesson. The only way to beat the system was to become, temporarily, the enemy. The quiet tyranny of the soil had driven him to the loud tyranny of the factory, and now the factory had demanded his principles as payment. The kettle was empty for the strikers, but Elijah Vance had just filled his own with the cold, bitter water of betrayal. His journey back to the manse would be heavier than his journey away. The 17th was fast approaching. The train ticket was a flimsy square of paper, but to Elijah Vance it felt like a certificate of absolution or damnation.
He bought it with 4 of his precious silver dollars, the ones he earned shoveling coal under the scrutiny of armed guards, while Saul and the other men shivered outside the picket line. He didn't look back at Abilene. He sat in the cheapest carriage, a smoking, rattling box of wood and iron, the smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies a constant reminder of the life he was leaving behind and the men he had abandoned. The journey west was a blur of high plains and the vast, indifferent sky. As the train moved, the landscape outside his window began to change. The dust and endless scrub gave way to subtle signs of industry, telegraph lines tracing perfect geometric paths across the wilderness, newly cut rail beds snaking through canyons, and occasionally the sudden garish eruption of a boomtown, a collection of false-fronted saloons and hastily erected boarding houses fueled by speculation and greed. He had $28.42 remaining, enough for the ticket, enough for the journey, and, crucially, enough for the sheriff. Elijah was fighting a local fight against a local bank. He could not yet grasp the true scale of the war he had stumbled into. The men who sought his family's rock were not interested in farming or even small-scale rail logistics. They were interested in an operation so vast, so intertwined with financial deception that it was, in the words of the time, the copper dream. 4 states away, in a private rail car attached to the Olympus Express, Amon Thorne and his chief strategist, Alistair Kincaid, surveyed the results of the strike. Thorne did not own a house in New York or Chicago. He owned the railroad that connected them and the vast tracts of land that bordered the line. His office was a mahogany-paneled room that sped perpetually across the continent, powered by the very coal the laborers were striking over. Thorne, the mogul, was a man in his late 50s, with eyes the color of iced bourbon and hands that had never seen a day of labor. He was impeccably dressed, his high collar starched, and his diamond stickpin glittering in the lamplight. He held a thin imported Cuban cigar, its smoke coiling elegantly toward the ceiling. "The strike is broken, Kincaid," Thorne observed, his voice a low, smooth monotone that carried the weight of absolute authority. "They'll be back to work tomorrow for the $1.50. Hunger always defeats sentiment." Kincaid, standing stiffly across the polished table, held a detailed map of the Panhandle, a map that centered cruelly on the Vance manse. "Yes, sir. We recruited 20 dozen transients, and the threat of the sheriff's men ensured compliance. The temporary wage increase to $4 was a judicious investment. They learned that collective action is a high-cost gamble. The lesson is the profit, Alistair. Always remember that. The cost of labor is measured in desperation, and a strike merely increases the desperation of those who fail, lowering the price for the next batch. Take a slow, deliberate puff. Now, let's discuss the copper dream. We are 7 days out from the deadline. We need the Vance land secured to close the financing package for the Abilene Water and Mineral Trust." Kincaid unrolled a schematic diagram across the table, smoothing the edges. It was a dizzying blueprint involving pipelines, sluices, and proposed copper smelters. "The manse is the linchpin, Amon," Kincaid explained, tapping the center of the Vance property with a silver pencil. "The rock formation beneath that property is not merely iron, as the local surveys suggest. Our private geological survey confirms it is a vein of high-grade copper sulfide, more valuable than 10,000 acres of corn." Thorne waved a dismissive hand.
The copper is merely the bait, Alistair. Kincaid nodded. Exactly. The copper operation requires vast amounts of water for processing and refining. We propose to buy the riparian rights to the Cimarron River running through the Vance land using the copper venture as justification. Once the rights are secured, we won't mine a single pound of ore. We will immediately convert the Abilene Water and Mineral Trust into the Abilene Water and Power Company and sell the water to every arid cattle ranch and developing town for 50 times the price. This was the gilded lie. The entire industrial push, the rail spur, the mortgage crisis, the strike, it was all a masterful, complex stage play designed to secure a monopoly on a basic human necessity: water. The superficial sheen of progress and mineral development masked the true cynical theft. And the investors, Torn? Are they convinced by the lie? Completely, sir. We have the Chicago Consortium, the Boston Capital Group, and the European bondholders all lined up eager to invest in this next great American copper rush. They see the railway you've laid, they see the forced labor, and they assume the venture is sound. The prospectus is a masterpiece of gilded rhetoric, all progress, industry, and American future. It says nothing of the simple theft of water rights. Thorne leaned back satisfied. The law, Kincaid, the law is the foundation of the Gilded Age. We create a legal pretext, mineral rights, and the state enforces the acquisition of the true asset, water. We will be heroes, bringing development to the West while simultaneously making every man in the Panhandle utterly dependent on us for survival. Kincaid then addressed the final troublesome detail: the farmer, Silas Vance, and his son.
The son, Elijah, is returning, Kincaid reported. He took 3 days of scab wages. He will arrive, at best, with $45, less travel expenses. He is under the delusion that he can redeem the property. Thorne laughed, a dry, humorless sound. $45 against $900, a pathetic resistance. I admire his drive, but not his math. When the sheriff serves the final papers, the boy will see that a small sack of nickels cannot defeat a 1,000-mile railroad. Precisely. But there is a complication, Eamon. Our local agent, Sheriff Brody, has proven unreliable in his subtlety. He is prone to excessive violence and boastful threats. If the old man, Silas Vance, is killed resisting eviction, the optics could jeopardize our land consolidation efforts. The press, even our controlled outlets, enjoys a good martyr. Bourne considered this, tapping his finger on the polished table. No martyrs, Alistair. The law must be seen to be followed, even in a transaction this dirty. We want to crush their spirit, not their skull. That is the difference between a corporation and a common thug. I have already dispatched a more discreet resource, Kincaid assured him. A special troubleshooter, a man named Marcus Riker. Riker is a former Pinkerton agent. He is a master of non-lethal, non-violent enforcement. He will arrive in the Panhandle on the 16th, the day before the deadline. His instructions are simple. Ensure the manse is vacant by sunrise on the 17th without firing a shot. He is to use any means necessary to secure the property and intimidate the Vances into signing a quitclaim deed for a nominal fee. The quitclaim is important, Alistair. I want every appearance of a willing transaction. A small payment, a signature, and the land is ours, legally and irrevocably, with no taint of violence. It is arranged, Eamon. The documents are in Riker's possession. The gilded lie is almost complete. Elijah, meanwhile,
was experiencing the flip side of the Gilded Age, the raw, unpolished, and dangerous realities of the boom. The train stopped abruptly in the middle of nowhere, flanked by temporary shacks and a massive, chaotic construction site. This was a place called Copper Creek, a new town that had sprung up overnight to service Thorne's supposed mining operations. Elijah disembarked to stretch his legs and buy a coffee. The town was a frenzy of activity, smelling of sweat, sawdust, and cheap whiskey. Men were everywhere, hauling lumber, arguing over claims, and pouring concrete foundations. Every face was hungry, driven by the myth of immediate wealth. He overheard a conversation between two men, a grizzled prospector and a slick-haired land speculator in the general store. "This Copper Creek is a joke, Jed," the speculator scoffed, adjusting his ill-fitting velvet coat. "There's no copper here. The assays are all faked. It's all stock promotion. Thorne is just using this as leverage to seize the water rights down south." "The water rights on the Cimarron River?" the prospector asked, spitting a wad of tobacco juice onto the dusky floor. "Exactly. It's the only reliable source for 200 miles. They'll build the rail spur, claim they need the water for the massive copper smelters, and then charge everyone $5 a barrel. The whole town is a lie, a pump and dump scheme. The real money is in the panic they're creating." Elijah froze, the lukewarm coffee mug halfway to his lips. Copper, water rights, Cimarron River. These words, innocent enough individually, slammed together in his mind with the force of a train wreck. He suddenly realized the $900 wasn't a random number. It was the price of a small parcel, the key that unlocked the river access. The rail spur was a red herring. The copper was a gilded lie. He wasn't fighting a local mortgage. He was standing on the single most critical piece of real estate in a multi-million-dollar corporate scheme designed to hijack the water supply of an entire region. His father wasn't holding a piece of dirt. He was sitting on a fortress protecting the Cimarron River. Elijah's mind flashed back to the dusty fields, the dry creek beds, and the relentless drought. If Thorne gained control of the Cimarron River, the entire panhandle, farmers, ranchers, even the small towns, would be entirely at his mercy. The shame of scabbing, of betraying Saul, felt secondary to the scale of the deceit. He had become an unknowing tool of the men planning to starve the entire region to death, not just economically, but literally. He finished his coffee and returned to the train, the weight of his small sack of money suddenly feeling heavier than the $900 debt. He had $28.42 and a train ticket. He had 7 days to get home, but now he had 7 days to prepare for a different kind of war. The train was delayed by a washout further down the line, an unexpected hiccup that threatened Thorne's careful timetable. The conductor announced the delay would be overnight. Elijah watched the sun set over the flat plains, illuminating a vast, unsettling emptiness that mirrored the hollowness in his chest. He was close now, only a day's ride from the familiar dusty red earth of home.
As he tried to sleep, a figure slipped into the empty seat across from him, a man in a dark, expensive wool suit, clean-shaven, with eyes that seemed to take in everything while giving nothing away. This was Marcus Riker, Kincaid's troubleshooter, traveling incognito. "Hard journey, isn't it?" Riker said, his voice quiet, almost kind. He offered Elijah a polished metal flask. "Take a pull, helps with the dust." Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm fine." "Suit yourself. I travel light, always have. See, a man who has nothing can't be bought, but a man who has something he loves, a wife, a family, a piece of land, that man is always vulnerable." Elijah felt a sudden cold prickle of fear. Riker was too smooth, too observant for a random traveler. You headed far? Elijah asked, trying to sound casual. Riker smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Very far, son. I'm headed to the Panhandle, a specific piece of land, actually. A place with a troublesome old man and a big, beautiful rock formation. A place that's resisting a transaction. Elijah felt the air leave his lungs. He was looking directly into the face of the unseen hand. Seems like a lot of trouble for one piece of dirt, Elijah managed, forcing the words out. Riker leaned in, resting his elbows on his knees. It's not the dirt, son. It's the lesson. Eamon Thorne is building the future. And in the future, men like you and your father don't get to decide what happens to the natural world. The mogul decides. You can stand in front of a train, but you just get run over. Riker reached into his inner pocket and produced a thick wad of bills, easily $1,000. He held it casually, the money fanning out like a peacock's tail. I'm going to that farm to convince the old man to sign the papers for $1,000, Riker whispered. If he signs, he walks away with more cash than he's seen in his life. If he resists, the law will handle it on the 17th. But I'd rather avoid the mess. Now, you look like a decent, smart boy who made a hard decision to save his father. You already know how to make the tough call. Go talk to him. Son, tell him that rock is worth a lot of shame, but it's not worth his life. Riker slid the entire stack of money across the seat, right to Elijah's hand. Take this, Riker urged. It's clean. $1,000. You give this to your father. Tell him to sign the quitclaim. Tell him he fought the good fight, but the time is up. Save the old fool before he gets himself killed protecting a copper dream that doesn't exist. Elijah stared at the money. $1,000. It not only covered the $900 debt, but gave his family a fresh start, a chance to move to the city, a chance to finally live free of the curse of the rock. He could undo the strike, undo the debt, undo everything with one stroke. He looked at Riker, then down to his small stack of $28.42, then at the 1,000. The choice was almost unbearable. The gilded lie was complete. It had offered him a way out, paved with gold and sealed with a promise of peace. He pushed the $1,000 back across the seat. Tell Mr. Thorne to take his money and burn it, Elijah said, his voice low and shaking, but suddenly steel hard. The rock isn't for sale, and neither is the Cimarron River. Riker's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory gleam. Wrong choice, son. See you on the 17th. Riker collected his money and disappeared into the night car, leaving Elijah alone with the terrifying realization that he was no longer just paying a mortgage. He was defending the water source for his entire world, and the true enemy, ruthless, financed, and professional, was already on the ground, waiting. His arrival home would not be a redemption, but the start of a final, unwinnable siege.
The train spat Elijah out onto the dusty platform of Jericho Creek 2 days before the deadline. The air was colder here, heavier with the smell of coal smoke and the metallic tang of something cheap burning. It was nearing midnight, and the town, usually a cacophony of saloon pianos and cattle shouts, was oppressively quiet. The strike was broken, and the silence was the sound of defeat. Elijah's mind was a frantic engine running on adrenaline and the horrifying knowledge Marcus Riker had given him. Water, not copper, not iron, but the Cimarron River. The manse wasn't just a home, it was the dam wall that held back the mogul's flood of greed. He had less than $30, a worn rifle he hadn't fired in years, and the cold assurance of Riker's parting smile echoing in his ears. See you on the 17th. He bypassed the brightly lit, gaudy saloons of Main Street. Those were places for the naive, the speculators, and the men who had broken the strike. He needed a place where the broken men gathered, where the bitterness of betrayal was still fresh and thick as chewing tobacco. He found it 3 blocks down, in a back alley behind the rail depot, marked only by a weak, flickering oil lamp hung over a door. The place was known locally as the Alley Smoke. It was a workers' canteen during the day, but at night it became a clandestine gathering spot for the union men, smelling strongly of burnt coffee, stale beer, and profound resentment. Elijah pushed through the warped wooden door. The air inside was so dense with smoke from cheap cigars, pipe tobacco, and a stove struggling to heat the room that it hurt his lungs. The light was poor, casting long, distorted shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The faces turned toward him were hard, suspicious, and worst of all, familiar. He spotted him instantly. Saul Peterson, sitting at a corner table with 2 other men Elijah recognized from the rail yard picket line. Saul's face, usually jovial despite the hardship, was drawn and grim. His left eye was nearly swollen shut, a strike souvenir. Elijah walked toward the table. Every eye in the room followed him. There was no greeting, no friendly nod, only a collective tightening of muscles and a chilling cessation of conversation. "Saul," Elijah said, his voice husky. Saul didn't look up, but the 2 men flanking him shifted, blocking Elijah's access to the table. "Get out, Vance," Saul said, his voice flat, emotionless. "The management's dollar still stinks of the yards. We don't drink with scabs." "I know I messed up, Saul," Elijah pleaded, keeping his voice low. "I took the money. I needed the $4. I didn't know then what I was doing, but I know now. Please, I need 5 minutes. One of the men, a giant named Jed, moved closer, his shoulder brushing Elijah's chest. 5 minutes? 5 minutes for what? To brag about the full meal you ate while we were eating river water and dust? Get lost. It's about the water, Saul, Elijah insisted, looking Jed straight in the eye. It's about the Cimarron River. Thorne doesn't want copper. It's a lie. He wants the water. That word, water, did what no apology could. Saul lifted his head and his single good eye fixed on Elijah. He signaled Jed to back down with a tiny nod. "Sit," Saul commanded, pointing to the empty chair. Elijah sat, pulling his chair close. The other men remained tense, listening. "Start talking, Vance, and it better be good enough to risk getting my other eye smashed in for listening to a Judas." Elijah spoke quickly, urgently, laying out everything Riker had told him and everything he had overheard at Copper Creek. He explained the scale of Thorne's operation, the railroad spur, the fake assays, the Chicago money, the conversion of the Water and Mineral Trust to the Water and Power Company. "They don't care about the ore," Elijah explained, gripping the edge of the wooden table until his knuckles were white. "They are creating a legal right to divert the Cimarron River. Once they own the river's riparian rights, they can sell every rancher and every town downstream the water they need to survive. The mortgage on the manse isn't about $900. It's about the final legal bottleneck to the river. They are building a monopoly on life itself." A low murmur rippled through the small room. The other striking men, hardened as they were, looked shocked. They had been fighting for fair wages. They had not realized they were fighting for the very right to drink. Saul listened, his good eye narrowed, occasionally rubbing the bruised one. When Elijah finished, the silence in the alley smoke was absolute, save for the crackling of the stove fire. "Proof," Saul finally said. "This is a big claim, Elijah, bigger than a train mogul. We were fighting for dollars. You're talking about war for survival. Where is the proof?" "It's in the manse deed," Elijah said. "My father, Silas, always insisted on the historical details. When the original homestead was granted, it was designated a protectorate site, something about the ancient rock formation being a landmark. I remember reading it once. He has the original deed locked in his desk. If that deed, that original patent, grants an unusual right, a right that supersedes or complicates simple foreclosure, it might buy us time, or better yet, it might legally restrict the use of the water even if they own the land. But we have to find it and prove it before the sheriff serves the final papers tomorrow at dawn. Saul shook his head slowly. The old man won't give it up. He wouldn't even let the sheriff look at it.
He doesn't have a choice now, Elijah countered. He's fighting for $900. I'm fighting for the entire valley. We need a way to get the deed out and get it to the territorial court immediately before the sheriff's eviction notice is processed. If we can't stop the foreclosure, we have to stop the subsequent sale of the water rights. Suddenly, the door burst open. The rush of cold air was followed by the loud, authoritative tread of heavy boots. "Brody," Saul hissed, instantly recognizing the sheriff's profile silhouetted against the weak exterior light. Sheriff Brody was a large man, accustomed to making his own gravity in Jericho Creek. He was flanked by 2 deputies. The whole scene was a stark contrast to the quiet desperation of the Union men. "Well, well," Brody drawled, letting his eyes sweep slowly over the room. "Look what the wind blew in. The prodigal son. Returned to the mud with the rest of the rats." His gaze settled on Elijah. "Vance, we heard you came back. Thought maybe you'd have the sense to bring the money with you." "I brought the truth, Sheriff," Elijah said, pushing his chair back and rising slowly, making sure his hands were visible. "The truth is whatever I say it is, boy. And the truth is, your daddy loses his land tomorrow morning. I got the final order, signed, sealed, and ready to serve. I got a special assignment to escort you and your father off that land before sunup. Make it easy on yourself, and more importantly, easy on the old man." Brody's eyes scanned the table, settling on Saul. "Peterson, still associating with radicals. Your kind never learns. You're lucky Thorne didn't press charges for property damage during the strike." "We're just drinking, Sheriff," Saul said, his voice dangerously even. "No laws broken here." "Not yet," Brody agreed, taking another step further into the room, his boots crunching on something gritty on the floor. "But I heard rumors, Vance, about a certain Pinkerton agent passing through, a man looking for a quick, tidy resolution to your little land problem. Said he offered a generous offer, well over the mortgage amount, just to save the old man the embarrassment of a forced removal." Elijah realized this was Brody's way of gloating, showing off his superior knowledge of the power structure. "I refuse the bribe," Elijah confirmed. "The manse is not for sale." "Bribe? No, son. That was a mercy. Now it's not a mercy, it's an eviction. And there's a professional on site now. Marcus Riker is a patient man, but he doesn't like loose ends. You, Vance, are a loose end. You're trying to save a father who doesn't want saving, and you're getting in the way of a corporation that's already bought and paid for this whole territory." Brody took another step, closing the distance. "I suggest you leave town, Vance, now. Get on the next eastbound train, because if Riker finds you near that farm, I won't be able to protect you, and Riker doesn't care about headlines." This was the reckoning. Elijah had to make a choice. Retreat and save himself, or confront the local authority and risk immediate, certain jail time, which would stop his plan before it even began. "You're a paid puppet, Brody. You think you're enforcing the law, but you're just carrying water for a man who's going to dry up the entire panhandle. That copper dream is a lie. Thorne is stealing the river, and you're the last obstacle to the people drinking clean water." Brody's face turned scarlet. He was used to fear, not public accusation. He took 2 fast steps and grabbed Elijah's shirt front, hauling him half out of the chair. "You call me a puppet? You call me a thief?
I'll teach you about the law boy resisting a sheriff in the line of duty." As Brody raised his hand, Saul moved with unexpected speed, knocking the sheriff's elbow hard with the heavy metal coffee pot he'd been holding. The clang echoed violently. "He's not resisting, Sheriff," Saul said calmly, his chair scraping back. "He's just stating a fact. Now let him go." Brody roared in pain and fury, momentarily stunned. He shoved Elijah hard against the wall, then turned to face Saul, drawing his revolver halfway out of his holster. "Assaulting a lawman, Peterson? You just bought yourself 5 years." This was the signal. Jed and the other men surged forward, forming a tight, menacing semicircle behind Saul. They weren't armed with guns, but with hard stares and years of pent-up rage over broken strikes and broken promises. "This is not your fight, Sheriff," Jed growled, stepping forward. "This is a private meeting. You broke the strike. You can't break the spirit."
Brody hesitated. 3 against 8, in a smoky, dark room filled with men he had personally humiliated. Even with his gun, the risk was too great. Thorn wanted compliance, not a massacre in a back-alley saloon. Brody slowly reholstered his gun, his chest heaving with frustrated anger. He glared at Elijah. "You're lucky, Vance, but your luck runs out at sunrise. You and your daddy will be off that land, or you'll be carried off. The law is coming." He pointed a thick, accusing finger at Saul. "And you, Peterson, you're next. Mark my words." Brody spun around and stormed out, his deputies scrambling to keep pace, slamming the door shut behind them. The moment they were gone, the tension in the room collapsed. Saul rubbed his elbow where he'd impacted Brody's. "Thanks, Saul," Elijah breathed. "I owe you. Again." "Forget the debt," Saul said, waving his hand impatiently. "You were right about one thing. This is bigger than a wage strike. The Cimarron is life. If Thorn gets the water, we all lose, even those of us who kept our land. You say the key is the man's deed? It has to be. It's the only leverage we have left. The whole region is doomed if we don't prove that deed contains an easement or historical restriction on development." Saul looked around the room at the other men, their faces now grimly determined. "Jed, you know the old wagon road that cuts through the north ridge of the Vance property?" "Yeah, hidden. Rough ride." "Good. Elijah, you can't go in the front door. Brody and his deputies will be watching the road all night, and Riker is waiting for you at the house. You're too valuable in the morning. We need you to take the deed straight to the territorial court. If they serve papers at dawn, you need to be halfway to the Capitol with the document." Saul looked back at Elijah, his eyes blazing with a new, shared purpose. "We will create a diversion. Jed and the others will go in with me. We'll make enough noise on the main approach to draw Riker and the sheriff's men away from the house. Your father knows the rock better than anyone. He'll have a hiding spot for that deed, something only he knows." "No, I have to go in," Elijah protested. "He won't trust anyone but me." "And you'll be arrested before you get 10 feet into the yard," Saul snapped, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "Listen to me, Elijah. This is the new rule. No more lone wolves. We are a community. We protect our assets. You are the runner. You know the true stakes. We will get the old man to give up the deed, but we need you safe and ready to ride." Elijah looked at the faces around the table. The men he had unknowingly betrayed just days ago, now they were his shield and his army. The Gilded Age, with all its power, had just pushed them past the point of petty strikes into a fight for collective survival. "If you can get the deed," Elijah said, feeling the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, "I will ride nonstop. I'll make it to the court, and I'll use every cent I have left to hire a lawyer to block Thorne's water grab. But if you fail, you must get my father out of there alive. That's my condition." "Done," Saul confirmed, shaking Elijah's hand with a fierce grip. "Now, Jed,
Gather what you can. Axes, ropes, a couple of shotguns. We move out in 30 minutes. We'll approach the man's from the south pasture. Saul turned to Elijah, the shadows in the alley smoke momentarily softening the hard lines of his face. Go, Elijah, go find your horse, and pray that old Silas Vance is ready to trust his friends. Elijah nodded, adrenaline surging through him. He stood, turned, and walked out of the alley smoke, leaving behind the smoke, the stale beer, and the broken men who had just decided to risk everything to defend a resource they didn't even own. He knew now that the reckoning had begun, not against a debt, but against an empire. The battle for the manse and the water would be decided at dawn. Elijah found his horse, Duke, still tied securely at the livery stable near the depot. He paid the stable boy his last $5 for feed and water, saddling the horse quickly and efficiently. He had perhaps an hour before Saul and the Union men started their risky, noisy approach. He rode out of Jericho Creek under the cold, silent stars, the knowledge of the imminent conflict burning in his chest. His small sack of remaining silver felt heavy, no longer a symbol of his failure, but a weapon, the last financial resource to fight the mogul's armies of lawyers and bankers. He knew Riker would be waiting. He knew Brody would be patrolling. But he was no longer alone. He had the truth, an oath, and the reconciled and fiery spirit of the men he had wronged. The Gilded Age had taught him a brutal lesson. Individual effort was meaningless. Only collective action could challenge the new corporate titans. As he turned his horse onto the dusty path leading toward the wilderness, he heard something. The muffled thud of horses' hooves and the distant metallic clink of tools being loaded onto a wagon. It was Saul and his team. They were moving. Elijah gave Duke the rein and galloped into the darkness, racing towards the dawn that would either bring the salvation of the valley or the total, irreversible reign of the Copper Dream.
The Vance manse sat heavy and silent on the ridge, a crumbling monument to a promise the Gilded Age had failed to keep. Built of local limestone nearly 40 years ago by Elijah's grandfather, it was meant to be the start of a dynasty, a bedrock of self-sufficiency. Now, under the waning afternoon light of the 16th of October, it was just a target, marked for reclamation by the Denver and Pacific Railroad and the financial mechanism of the Copper Creek Trust. Elijah rode Duke hard through the twilight, approaching the manse from the rough, wooded north side as Saul Peterson had instructed. He tethered the horse in a thicket of dry brush, the air already sharp with the coming cold. He knew Riker's men were close. He saw the faint telltale tracks of carriage wheels turning off the main road, not the sheriff's familiar heavy tires, but the sleek, shallow cuts of a private vehicle, likely the Pinkerton agents. Marcus Riker, the patient viper, was already on the property, waiting for the legal hammer to fall at dawn. The kitchen door was unlocked, a detail that was both a relief and a profound grief. Silas Vance had never left a door unbolted in his life. The man was so focused on holding the line against the visible world, rustlers, droughts, stray animals, he had forgotten to guard against the invisible enemy, the bankers and the tycoons who stole wealth through paperwork. Elijah stepped into the familiar gloom. The air was thick with the scent of dust, old leather, and the unique metallic smell of a house that had been too cold for too long. He found his father, Silas Vance, not in his usual chair by the hearth, but at the massive oak roll-top desk in the parlor, the same desk where Elijah had learned to write his name and calculate crop yields. Silas was an image of weathered, unyielding pride. His white hair was neatly combed, his faded wool shirt was buttoned to the throat, and his hands, gnarled and powerful from decades of fighting the hard-scrabble land, rested on the polished wood. But the iron had gone out of his posture. He looked shrunken, defeated, lost in the shadow of the desk. On the mahogany surface, spotlit by the last thin slice of sunlight entering the tall window, lay two items that defined the whole struggle.
First, the mortgage note. It was a single stark white document, signed in a spidery hand, stamped with the severe red seal of the Copper Creek Water and Mineral Trust. The number $900 was circled in aggressive black ink. It was the physical embodiment of the Gilded Age's cruelty, a small, manageable debt suddenly called in with the speed of a snake strike, leaving no time to scramble. Second, nestled beside it, was the keepsake. It was a small leather-bound volume, no larger than a prayer book, its cover embossed with a stylized ancient compass rose. It was his mother's daily journal, given to her by Silas on their wedding day, and it contained not prayers, but maps, weather notes, and, crucially, her meticulous sketches of the surrounding terrain and the Cimarron River's flow. Elijah walked slowly toward his father. "Pa," he said, his voice low and steady, trying to convey respect and urgency in a single syllable. Silas did not look up. He traced the number $900 with a trembling finger, his gaze locked on the paper. "They will be here at sunrise, son," Brody sent word. "The final service. They will take it all. 40 years of blood, 40 years of sweat." "We know, Pa, but they won't be taking the water rights," Elijah asserted, placing his hands on the desk near the two critical objects. Silas finally looked up. His eyes, usually fierce blue, were clouded with stubborn despair. "Water rights? What does a boy who ran off to the city chasing paper fortunes know of water rights? This is about cash, Elijah. $900. If I had simply waited on the harvest, if the rains had been a week sooner, if the freight rates hadn't quadrupled after Thorne's Railroad came through." "It's not the rain, Pa, and it's not the freight rates," Elijah cut in, firmly but gently. "Those things are symptoms. The disease is Thorne. The debt is a distraction. The Copper Creek Trust is converting the manse and its land into a water utility. They don't want the copper. The assay was a fabrication. They want the river. Once they have this ridge, they control the Cimarron's watershed, and they can charge every farmer, every town, every soul in this county whatever they please for water." Silas recoiled as if struck. "That's madness! Thorne is a railroad man, a mining magnate." "He's a monopolist, Pa. He built the railroad to control freight, he faked the mine to control the land, and he's using the foreclosure to control the water. He's cornering the market on existence." Elijah leaned in, keeping his voice a conspiratorial whisper despite their being alone. "I spoke to the union men, Pa. They are with us. They understand the stakes now. They are creating a diversion tonight to pull Riker and Brody away from the manse. I need the original deed, the one that refers to the manse as a protectorate site. I need to ride to the territorial court tonight with that specific document. It might be the only legal leverage we have to stop the water diversion before it begins." Silas's hand shot out and clamped down on the keepsake, covering it. "The deed is here," he snapped, pointing to the mortgage note. "This is the deed of my failure. This is the only truth I need to face. You think a century-old piece of paper will stop a man who owns the governor? You're still dreaming, boy." The personal crisis, the failure of the independent farmer, was a mirror of the social struggle. Silas was so crushed by the shame of the $900 loss that he couldn't grasp the grand, unseen scheme that had made the loss inevitable. Elijah looked at the keepsake, under his father's protective hand. It was the leather-bound book his mother Clara had carried everywhere. He remembered her thin, elegant hands tracing contours on its pages, always studying the land, feeling its pulse. "No, Pa, that book, the keepsake," Elijah said softly. "The real key isn't the $900. It's Mama. She knew this land better than anyone. I remember her showing me a map in there, a sketch of the original survey. It showed the property lines were tied to a geological feature, the Sentinel Rock Formation. She always said that rock was important."
Silas flinched, the mention of Clara's name piercing his hardened shell. "The protectorate site, Pa. Riker told me that phrase. He was terrified of it. It's a clause from the 1880s land grants meant to protect unique geographical features, possibly restricting commercial exploitation like water diversion. If it's tied to the Sentinel Rock on this property, it could invalidate Thorne's entire scheme. Silas's gaze dropped back to the desk, landing on the mother's keepsake. The book, meant for family memories, was now the accidental, crucial piece of legal evidence. Clara, Silas whispered, his voice cracking. She wrote down everything, the drought years, the good years. She knew every crack in this foundation. She kept the original patent, the first deed from the government, inside that book. Said it was the only thing that really belonged to us. The rest was just paper from banks. Elijah carefully reached out, not to the book, but to his father's shoulder. Pa, that's the $900. That's the way out of this trap. You beat the bank. You just didn't know it yet. Silas slowly removed his hand from the book. He looked at the keepsake, then at the cruel white mortgage note, and finally into Elijah's eyes. The pride and anger were draining away, replaced with a devastating fatigue. After your mother, after she died of the fever, I had to take out the second mortgage. To pay the doctor, to bury her right. I promised her I would never let this land go, Elijah. It was the last thing I ever promised her. Silas's personal crisis, the grief and the impossible debt resulting from his wife's death, was the perfect hook for the trust. They didn't need a huge scandal. They just needed a man pushed to his breaking point by a common tragedy. That's why Thorne wins, Pa. He uses our grief, our honest debts, and our promises against us. But if we can use Mama's foresight, her memory of the land, we can fight him. The fight isn't to hold the manse, Pa. It's to save the river for everyone Mama loved in this valley. Elijah picked up the small, leather-bound keepsake. It felt heavy and fragile in his hands, imbued with the life and intelligence of the woman who had studied the land with a love Silas had reserved for his crops. Silas nodded, a tiny, devastating admission of defeat and surrender. It's in there, page 93, tucked inside the binding, the original parchment. Elijah carefully opened the back cover of the keepsake. The leather was stiff and dry. Between the last entry and the lining, there was a small, almost invisible slit. He gently pulled out a rolled, yellowed piece of parchment. It smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. This was it, the original land patent, the foundation of the Vance claim, and potentially the legal weapon against Thorne. As Elijah secured the document inside his coat, a sound from outside froze them both. The sharp crunch of boots on the gravel path. It was too soon for the Union men's diversion. "Riker," Silas whispered, terror flickering in his eyes. "Get down, Pa," Elijah commanded. He extinguished the small lamp on the desk. "He's scouting. He knows I'm here. He wants the deed to be gone forever." A shadow fell across the window. Elijah drew his rifle, the cold steel a brief comfort against the rising panic. He heard Riker's voice, smooth and chillingly controlled, speaking just outside the porch. "Silas Vance, I know your son is inside. I am simply here to offer a final, generous settlement. We don't need trouble, Mr. Vance. Just the signed final paperwork. We are prepared to offer you $3,000 for the property now, provided you hand over all historical documents pertaining to the land, including the original patent." The bribe had escalated dramatically. Riker knew the original patent existed and that its unique clause was a danger. He was willing to pay 3 times the debt just to silence the legal complication. "Go to hell, Riker," Silas shouted, fueled by a final desperate surge of his old pride. A harsh, short laugh came from outside. "Then I will see you in hell, Mr. Vance. At sunrise, if not sooner." The shadow moved away. Elijah lowered the rifle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the precious parchment. "He knows, Pa. He doesn't know I have it, but he knows you have it. He's going to stop the diversion and come back here." "You have to go," Silas urged. "Now. Go out the window. Take the north trail. They won't see you." "I can't leave you, Pa. Not with him out there." You have to, Elijah. This is the last thing I can do. I can slow him down. I can hold the manse for a few hours. The debt is my failure, but the water is your fight. Go, son. Use that old paper. Make sure your mother's land saves the valley. Elijah looked at his father, seeing not the stubborn old man, but the weary patriarch making a final sacrifice. He knew arguing was useless. Silas would never leave his post. Elijah grabbed a heavy canvas sack, quickly stuffing in a few hard biscuits, a canteen of water, and some extra ammunition. He placed the keepsake and the original patent deep inside his coat lining. "I'll be back, Pa," Elijah promised, the words thick with the weight of the coming separation. Silas gave him a ghost of a smile. "Go, runner. The Vance Manse has stood against 1,000 storms. It can stand against one more night." Elijah climbed out the low parlor window, dropping silently onto the damp earth. He made his way quickly through the shadows to where Duke was waiting. As he mounted up, he saw the faint, unsettling flicker of a lantern moving near the manse's main gate, Riker, perhaps, confirming the ambush. Elijah spurred Duke into a desperate silent gallop down the north trail, the yellowed parchment pressing against his heart. The mortgage note was a symptom of the social struggle. The keepsake was the personal, desperate hope for salvation. He had failed his family once by running from the farm, but he would not fail the valley now. He was racing against the dawn, against the corporate Leviathan, and against the certain knowledge that the next time he saw the manse, it might be ruined, but the river, the lifeblood of the territory, would be free.
The moment Elijah pulled Duke into the north trail leading away from the manse, the air felt less like atmosphere and more like the heavy, cold current of a river trying to drag him back. He rode not as a fugitive, but as a courier for survival, the yellowed original patent, the legal key to the entire Cimarron Valley, tucked deep within the canvas lining of his coat. He had barely put a mile between himself and the property line when he heard the shout. It was Marcus Riker, his voice cutting through the silent night air with the authority of a man unaccustomed to being thwarted. "Vance, stop now. You'll never outrun the trust." Elijah spurred Duke harder. He knew Riker was not relying on Sheriff Brody's slow, predictable patrols. Riker was a professional tracker and manager of resources. He would have better horses, maybe a small mobile team, and certainly a ruthless calculus that discounted Elijah's life entirely. Elijah was headed for Mesa, the nearest railhead town with a proper telegraph office and, more importantly, a circuit judge who handled territorial court matters. Mesa was 50 miles southwest, across the Salt-Licked Divide, a vast, unforgiving expanse of alkali flats. It was the fastest, most direct route, but it was treacherous, a skeletal landscape of dry mud beds, hidden sinkholes, and a thirst-inducing dust that clung to the throat. The safer route, the long, looping road around the divide, would take him well into the morning, far too late to beat the sunrise eviction and the subsequent filing of the final water diversion papers. He hit the edge of the divide just as the quarter moon dipped toward the horizon, plunging the landscape into near-total darkness. The ground beneath Duke's hooves changed instantly from firm prairie soil to the fine gypsum-laced dust of the flats. It tasted like bitter salt and felt like riding on flour. Elijah slowed Duke to a careful walk. The risk of stumbling into an unmarked fissure or a hidden mud spring was too great. Every mile here demanded concentration. He pulled the small, leather-bound keepsake from his coat. The mother's journal was his only compass in this desolate night. He couldn't read the script in the dark, but his mother had used the book not just for writing, but for feeling the land. He remembered her story of the divide, how after a harsh winter, the rains would leach minerals to the surface, but how there was a ghost trail known only to the first settlers that followed a vein of hard, ancient shale safe from the alkali's corrosive touch. Eliza scanned the horizon. Riker was coming. He could hear the faint, steady drumming of 2 horses, faster than Duke, and the occasional flash of a lantern far behind him. Riker was keeping pace and closing the gap. Think like Mama, Elijah commanded himself, not like the banker's boy. He needed a landmark. His eyes, now keenly adapted to the dark, searched the horizon for the split tooth, a distinctive, jagged mesa she had sketched on page 47 of the keepsake. He found it, a dark, asymmetrical shape piercing the southern sky. But to reach it, he would have to veer sharply west, crossing a known area of quicksand and sinking clay. "We followed the shale, boy," Elijah muttered to Duke, leaning forward and speaking into the horse's ear. He nudged Duke onto a course that felt intuitively wrong, a slight rise in the flats that seemed no different from the rest. He risked pulling out a lucifer, cupping the tiny sputtering flame with his left hand, and quickly flipped to page 47. The drawing showed the split tooth and a faint, thin line traced along an invisible contour. Next to it, in Mother's elegant script, was this: Shale Ridge Safe Line. Follow the subtle ripple where the old salt grass grows. 3 days from water to water. The salt grass. It was a coarse, tough weed that only grew where the alkali crust was thin enough to allow for drainage. Elijah extinguished the match and put the keepsake away. His eyes now searched the ground, not for landmarks, but for life. He found the grass, scraps of dry silver-green stalks stubbornly pushing through the chalky surface. It was a narrow, winding path, barely wider than the horse. Elijah let Duke pick his way along the subtle ripple of the safe line. The pace was slow, agonizingly so, but the ground was firm. Behind him, Riker's 2 horses were suddenly gaining, the sound of their hooves becoming frantic, irregular. Riker, confident in his superior speed and modern tracking methods, had simply tried to ride straight across the treacherous flats. Then came the sound Elijah had been dreading, a muffled, terrible squelch, followed by a horse's desperate, high-pitched scream. "Damn it!" Riker's voice, raw with rage and frustration, carried on the crisp air. The mud took the black gelding. "Get the spare pack horse, Jenkins. He's trying to cut through the flats." Riker had lost a horse and a valuable minute, a trade-off for Elijah that felt like a lifetime of grace. The land, the very thing Thorne sought to conquer, and the very thing Silas had nearly lost, was fighting back. Elijah pressed on, now moving with renewed vigor. He knew the danger was still imminent, but his resolve solidified. His mother's knowledge of the land, preserved in a book of personal history, had just saved him. He rode for 2 more hours, guided by the taste of the air and the feel of the ground beneath Duke. The ghost trail eventually led him to a small, nearly invisible spring, a trickle of water his mother had marked as the Tears of the Divide. He dismounted, letting Duke drink sparingly, and filled his canteen. He had pushed the horse and himself to the limit. He needed a few minutes to rest, or the final 10 miles would be impossible.
Just as he was about to remount, he heard it again, closer this time, the rhythmic, professional pace of Riker's single remaining mount. The agent was relentless, calculating, and now undoubtedly infuriated. Elijah realized Riker must have abandoned his men and pack animals, trusting his own superior riding and dedication to the mission. He was cutting the distance, closing in. Elijah couldn't hide on the open flats. The only way to win was to be faster and smarter. He checked his rifle, but he couldn't afford a shootout. The goal was delivery, not murder. He mounted Duke, pushing him to a sustained trot. The safe line was ending, giving way to the uneven, rocky ground that marked the approach to Mesa. He saw Riker before Riker saw him. The Pinkerton agent was a dark, lean silhouette against the emerging blue-gray pre-dawn sky.
his horse an indistinguishable shadow of speed and purpose. Riker spotted him just as Elijah broke free of the flats and onto the main rock-strewn trail. "Vance, stop. I know you have the deed," Riker yelled, his voice carrying the cold authority of the law. "That patent is worthless. Thorn owns the courts. Give it up now, and I'll guarantee your father's release from debtor's prison." Riker's words hit Elijah with the force of a physical blow. Debtor's prison. Thorn wasn't just taking the land, he was going to lock away Silas. This was the final, devastating play, the conversion of a private failure into a total public ruin. "You lie, Riker. Thorn only owns the governor, not the territorial court," Elijah shouted back, kicking Duke into a full gallop. The chase was now flat out reckless. Riker's horse, though better bred, was heavier. Duke, a sturdy ranch horse, knew the broken terrain and had the sheer will of a creature running for its life. They reached a narrow pass, a jagged cut through two low mesas. It was a perfect bottleneck, and Riker, riding with the precision of a cavalry officer, gained on him swiftly. As Riker pulled alongside, his hand darted out, grabbing the edge of Elijah's saddle blanket. The sudden jerk nearly unseated Elijah. "The paper, Vance, now," Riker demanded, his face tight with exertion, his gun hand hovering near his holster. Elijah swung his rifle, not to shoot, but to block. The heavy wooden stock caught Riker's arm, forcing him to momentarily let go of the blanket. In that instant of separation, Elijah executed the desperate, premeditated move. He hadn't brought the canvas sack full of supplies with him across the divide. It had been abandoned at the spring to lighten Duke's load. But he had one thing left, his father's old, heavy leather satchel, containing his grandfather's surveying instruments and a few family documents. With a grunt of pure effort, he yanked the satchel from his saddle horn and hurled it directly into the path of Riker's horse. The agent's horse, focused on the chase, stumbled and reared violently, neighing in pain and fear as the heavy leather bag tangled momentarily in its legs. Riker, caught off guard, was thrown hard from the saddle, landing in a cloud of alkali dust and small, sharp stones. His fall was sickening, and his cry of pain was immediate and sharp. Elijah did not look back. He poured every last ounce of energy into Duke, flying out of the narrow pass and onto the final, descending slope toward the lights of Mesa. The sun had just begun to paint the eastern sky, turning the salt-licked divide from a black void into a vast, shimmering plain of white and purple. He could see the single smoke plume of the train depot and the small cluster of buildings that was his destination. Duke, lathered with sweat and breathing in great ragged heaves, slowed to a trot as they hit the main street of Mesa. The town was just stirring. A man sweeping the boardwalk, a waitress opening a cafe. They looked up at the sight of the dust-covered, wild-eyed rider. Elijah dismounted near a small, dignified building marked Territorial Circuit Court. His legs felt like water, his mouth was a desert, and his lungs burned with the alkali dust. He staggered toward the door, clutching the parchment deep in his coat. He had crossed the divide. He had outrun the Gilded Age's most effective weapon. He had survived the night using the wisdom of his mother and the stubbornness of his father. He had won the physical race. He pushed open the door and entered the cool, quiet interior of the courthouse. The clock on the wall read 6:15 a.m. Sunrise was at 6:22 a.m. He had made it by a terrifyingly slim margin. A clerk, a sleepy-eyed young man in a clean suit, looked up at the sight of the dust-caked phantom standing in his office. "I need to see the judge," he gasped, leaning on the mahogany counter, trying to find enough breath to form the words. "Immediately. It's an urgent filing, a land dispute, the Vance Manse, Cimarron River, the original patent. This document," he choked out, "it's a protectorate site." I need an injunction against foreclosure and water rights transfer before 7 a.m. The clerk, recognizing the gravity in the man's eyes despite the grime, stared down at the ancient, handwritten document, then back up at Elijah. The battle for the river was no longer fought in the dark dust of the prairie. It had been transferred with terrifying speed to the fluorescent, cold certainty of the courtroom. The reckoning was moving from the alley smoke to the docket sheet. Elijah Vance, the runner, had done his part.
Elijah Vance stood in the cool, echoing silence of the territorial circuit court in Mesa, still breathing the chalky air of the salt-licked divide. The clerk, a startled young man named Peter, disappeared down a hallway, clutching the original patent and the keepsake. Elijah was alone, his body screaming for sleep, his mind fixed on the clock ticking toward the 7 a.m. deadline. The door opened, not with the hurried urgency of the pursuit, but with the quiet confidence of ownership. A man entered, dressed in a custom-tailored dark suit that seemed far too expensive and urban for the dusty plains. He was young, not much older than Elijah, with sharp, intelligent eyes, but his posture was stooped, not by age, but by some invisible, heavy burden. This was Samuel Thorne, Jr., the son and designated heir of Senator and mining magnate Cyrus Thorne, the man who managed the daily relentless operations of the Copper Creek Trust in the Cimarron Valley. He looked like the New World's ideal, polished, educated, and wealthy. Yet he moved like a figure carved from regret. Elijah recognized the face immediately from the hastily printed notices and newspaper sketches. The ghost, as the Union men had begun to call him, the man who implemented his father's ruinous will without apparent emotion. "Mr. Vance," Samuel Thorne Jr. said, his voice level and without accent, a perfect, neutral instrument of commerce. "I see you made it. That was quite a ride. I regret that my associate, Mr. Riker, had such a disastrous evening." Elijah straightened up, forcing himself to meet the gaze of the Trust's representative. "Tell your father the dust in the divide is tougher than any Pinkerton, Mr. Thorne." "I am Samuel, please. And the dust is temporary. The infrastructure is permanent." Samuel walked past the counter, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the stone floor. He carried a leather briefcase, heavy with what Elijah knew were the legal documents prepared to finalize the water transfer. "You're too late, Samuel," Elijah declared, his voice rough. "The patent is filed. I have a court order for a stay on the foreclosure and a review of the protectorate site clause. The Cimarron River is not yours to buy." Samuel paused by the clerk's empty desk, his fingers brushing the polished wood. He gave a small, weary smile. "You sound very much like the boy I once was, Elijah. Full of fight, fueled by words on paper. My father taught me the law is simply a tool, a slow, expensive hammer. We own the hammer and the forge where the paper is made." He looked at the space where the keepsake had been. "Is that your mother's journal, the leather-bound one with the compass rose?" Elijah was stunned by the personal knowledge. "How do you know that book?" Samuel's eyes drifted to the high, narrow courthouse window where the sun finally crested the horizon, washing the room in pale, cruel yellow light. "It belonged to the frontier. The real one, the one before the corporations arrived. My father and your grandfather Silas, they started together, you know. Not as rivals, but as dreamers. They met out near the salt-licked divide, both young men with patents and promises. Silas wanted a dynasty of self-sufficient farmers. Cyrus, my father, wanted to build a network of progress, railroads, clean water, power. They were the New World's hopefuls." He walked slowly toward a bench, resting his briefcase beside him.
Your grandfather Silas gave my father that book too for a time, when my mother, who was an amateur geologist, was charting the mineral deposits. She was looking for a rich copper vein, and she found it, but she also found something else, the Sentinel Rock Formation. She drew the first map of the Protectorate site. This is the Ballad of the New World Ghost. It's my story. I was raised on my father's idealism. He used to tell me we were building cathedrals of progress, that the mines and the rails would lift everyone out of poverty. I believed him. I went to school back east, studied engineering and law, ready to return and realize the vision. But when I came back 3 years ago, the vision was gone. It had turned into something else. It was no longer about building. It was about extraction. It was no longer about progress. It was about monopoly. Samuel spoke with a sudden, bitter intensity. When my father hit a temporary financial snag, he didn't adjust. He simply started destroying. He realized the fastest way to wealth wasn't digging copper, it was controlling the water. The Copper Creek Trust was his mechanism to squeeze the blood life out of the valley, making every farmer, every merchant, every town reliant on his price list. He pulled out a small worn silver flask from his inner coat pocket, took a quick, desperate sip, and continued. My father ordered me to execute the foreclosure on the Manus because of the water rights. He ordered me to fabricate the assay reports to convince the other investors of the mine's value. He ordered me to squeeze your father, Silas, until he choked on $900 of debt.
Elijah realized this was not an excuse, but a confession. The cry of a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own inheritance. So, you admit the debt was a smokescreen? That your father is destroying the livelihood of hundreds just to control the water? I admit I am the architect of the destruction, Samuel whispered, his voice thin. I write the letters. I file the papers. I am the ghost. I haunt this territory, implementing the ruin I swore to prevent. Every time I sign a document for the trust, I betray the man my father was and the man I was supposed to be. A silence settled between them, heavy and charged. Samuel Thorne Jr., the instrument of the New World's worst excesses, was a man utterly lost, disillusioned by the transformation of progress into greed. The clerk, Peter, shuffled back into the room, holding the keepsake and the original patent carefully. Judge Merritt will see you both, gentlemen. He is reviewing the emergency filing now. Samuel stood up, transforming instantly back into the cool, immaculate executive. The brief moment of vulnerability was gone. He picked up his briefcase. Now, Elijah, Samuel said, his voice firm, we move from confession to competition. I recognize the Protectorate Site Clause. It is a formidable challenge. It was put there to protect the Sentinel Rock as an official geological and natural landmark. If the court upholds its validity, it restricts any major commercial development, especially large-scale water diversion or mining that would alter the hydrological landscape. He opened his briefcase, revealing the stack of corporate documents. But you see, my filing is already prepared. It claims the Sentinel Rock Formation has been sufficiently degraded by natural erosion and previous small-scale farming operations, your family's operations, to render the Protectorate Clause null and void. We also have 3 affidavits from geologists who were hired to sign them. You have one piece of old parchment. I have an army of experts and 500 pages of legal precedent. This was the trap. Elijah had the moral high ground and the historical document, but Samuel had the machine of modern, corporate law. What is your game, Samuel? Why tell me any of this? Samuel looked toward the door leading to the judge's chambers. I told you, Elijah, I am the ghost. I can't stop the machine, but I can clog the gears. You made it here in time. I thank you for the challenge. You are giving me the only fight I had in years." Just then, the main door burst open. Marcus Riker stood there, hobbling slightly, his expensive coat torn and covered in the unmistakable white dust of the Salt Lick Divide. His face was a mask of cold fury, and his hand was firmly on the butt of his pistol. "Thorn, you didn't file," Riker barked, ignoring Elijah entirely. "I just received a wire from Denver. They need the final water permit filed now. The governor is signing the enabling act at noon." Riker saw the clerk holding the original patent and moved quickly toward Samuel. "Where is the patent? Did you get the patent, Samuel? This man is a thief and his father is in contempt." Samuel stood his ground, placing his body between Riker and the clerk. "I am in control of this filing, Riker. The legal integrity of the trust is at stake. I must ensure the documentation is correct. I found a minor discrepancy in the boundary descriptions on the trust's deed filing. I will correct it and file within the hour." He had bought time. A precious hour where the legal hammer of the trust was held aloft. Samuel Thorne Jr. had chosen a calculated internal form of sabotage, just enough hesitation to let the law take its course, but not enough to truly betray his father and ruin himself. Riker, however, was focused on the immediate threat, the man who had nearly killed him in the dark. He glared at Elijah. "You won't escape the courts, Vance. You're fighting the bank, the railroad, and the entire territorial government. You have 1 hour, and then the full weight of the trust will crush you and your ghost-ridden farm." Judge Merritt's door opened. "Mr. Vance, Mr. Thorne, please step inside. We have an injunction to review before the morning docket is called." Elijah straightened his coat, feeling the weight of the mother's keepsake against his chest. It was not just a journal. It was the documented, loving history of the land, pitted now against a mountain of legal fiction. He walked past Riker and entered the judge's chambers. Samuel followed, giving Elijah a brief, fleeting glance. The look of one prisoner recognizing another, both trapped by the new world, but now fighting on opposite sides of the law. The ballad of the ghost was sung, and the final stanza of the Vance family's stand was about to be written.
Judge Silas Merritt, a man whose face was carved by decades of listening to frontier grievances, sat behind the immense scarred oak bench. The territorial circuit court chambers were small, designed for arbitration, not drama, yet the air crackled with the suppressed energy of the conflict, the Cimarron Valley's future reduced to the weight of 2 piles of paper on the judge's desk. On the judge's right, Elijah Vance, still dusty and sweat-stained, stood alone, the mother's keepsake clutched in his hand. On the judge's left, Samuel Thorne Jr., impeccable in his tailored suit, his face a mask of weary professionalism, represented the Copper Creek Trust. Behind him, hovering near the door, was Marcus Riker, the Pinkerton agent, his presence a silent threat of physical force against any unfavorable ruling. Judge Merritt began, his voice gravelly but clear. "Mr. Vance has filed for an emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure on the Vance Manse and, crucially, to prevent the immediate transfer of Cimarron River water rights to the Copper Creek Trust. The basis of the claim is the validity of this original land patent, issued in 1888, containing a protectorate site clause concerning the Sentinel Rock Formation." The judge picked up the yellowed parchment, examining the faded script. "Mr. Thorne, the trust's claim rests on an outstanding debt and the legal argument that the protectorate site clause is obsolete due to alleged natural degradation of the Sentinel Rock Formation, which they claim nullifies the environmental restrictions." Samuel stepped forward, opening his heavy briefcase. "Your Honor, the trust concedes the protectorate clause existed. However, we have amassed substantial evidence,
geological reports, photographic documentation dating back 2 decades, and notarized affidavits proving that the Sentinel Rock area has been subjected to significant erosion. The protective language in the 1888 patent was tied to the geological integrity of the formation. That integrity is gone. He laid out a stack of glossy bound reports. It was an overwhelming presentation of modern corporate litigation, clean, cold, and irrefutable, designed to bury the truth under the weight of sheer volume. Elijah felt a sudden cold panic. He was fighting a cannon with a slingshot. He had a story, a history, and a mother's drawing. Samuel had geology degrees and the power of the Federal Survey Office. "Your Honor," Elijah began, his voice shaky, "my family never caused the erosion. That land, the Sentinel Rock, it's the headwater for the Cimarron. It's the only place the old shale line, the groundwater table, holds solid. My mother, God rest her soul, she didn't just farm there. She knew that land. She used this." She laid the keepsake, the leather-bound journal, on the bench. "It's a record, a living map of the valley before the heavy machinery arrived." Judge Merrick glanced at the journal, then back at Samuel. "Mr. Thorne, the trust's current filing, which I was about to submit before Mr. Vance's emergency injunction, relies on the 1905 territorial survey. That survey, commissioned by the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, slightly redefined the boundaries of the Sentinel Rock, placing the most critical deep water channel just outside the protectorate zone. If the court accepts the 1905 boundary, the water transfer is legal." He paused, gathering the courage for the pact sealed on shaking ground. "However, Your Honor, in the interest of judicial diligence, and because of the compelling nature of this original 1888 patent, I must point out a discrepancy in the methodology of the 1905 survey. A review of my late mother's field notes, a geological amateur but highly meticulous, suggests that the surveyor hired by the railroad, a man named Mr. Peabody, made a fundamental error." Riker tensed visibly by the door. Elijah stared at Samuel Thorne, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of disbelief. Samuel Thorne Jr. was using his own family's history to dismantle his father's case? "The error, Your Honor," Samuel pressed on, his voice now firm, "is the misidentification of a key metamorphic fault line, which is crucial for determining the true hydrological boundary. My mother's journal, which Mr. Vance has placed before you, and which I recognize, contains a drawing on page 47 that accurately maps this fault line." He pointed to the journal on the bench. If Judge Merritt compares the boundary description in the 1888 Vance patent to the geographic feature identified in my mother's sketch, he will find that the Sentinel Rock's protective zone does indeed encompass the deep water channel the trust intends to divert. The 1905 boundary is, frankly, incorrect. Riker slammed his hand against the doorframe, the sound echoing through the small room. "Your Honor, this is an objection. Mr. Thorne is sabotaging the trust case. He is providing inadmissible hearsay evidence from a personal journal."
Judge Merritt raised a hand, silencing Riker. "Mr. Riker, you are not licensed to practice law in this court, and I do not tolerate threats to judicial integrity. Sit down." The judge turned to Samuel, his eyes narrowed, searching for the true motive. "Mr. Thorne, you are actively undermining the financial and legal interests of your client and your father. Why?" Samuel met the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, the Copper Creek Trust seeks a temporary stay on its own motion to finalize the water rights transfer. We request a full 2-week examination period to commission a new neutral survey of the Sentinel Rock Formation, using the original 1888 boundaries and correcting the error pointed out by my mother's notes. This is not sabotage. It is ensuring the permanence of the law over the expediency of business." It was a masterstroke of corporate maneuvering. Samuel couldn't lose the case, but he could force a stay by claiming due diligence. By throwing the challenge back to a neutral party, a new surveyor, and referencing Elijah's historical document, he forced a temporary but crucial pact sealed on shaking ground. A pact between himself and his own conscience under the duress of his father's impending signing ceremony. Judge Merritt took a long, reflective breath, looking from Elijah's desperate face to Samuel's weary one. He understood the subtext. The son of the king had just rebelled, not with the sword, but with a perfectly legal delay. Mr. Vance, do you concur with the Trust's request for a 2-week stay and a new survey to confirm the 1888 boundary? Elijah, grasping the lifeline Samuel had tossed him, nodded fiercely. Yes, Your Honor, I concur. Very well, Judge Merritt announced, bringing his gavel down with a sharp, decisive crack. Based on the compelling historical evidence of the 1888 patent and the acknowledgement of potential boundary errors by the representative of the Copper Creek Trust, this court grants the injunction. The foreclosure on the Vance manse is stayed for 2 calendar weeks. Furthermore, the transfer of water rights to the Copper Creek Trust is halted pending the results of a court-appointed independent survey of the Sentinel Rock Protectorate site. The epilogue of the ghost. The gavel strike echoed in the sudden silence. Elijah felt the tension drain from his body, replaced by a wave of pure, bone-deep fatigue. He had won a temporary reprieve. The farm was safe for 2 weeks. Riker didn't wait for permission to leave. He turned on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming behind him, a clear signal that the Pinkerton agent was heading for the nearest telegraph office to report Samuel's betrayal to Senator Cyrus Thorne. Samuel Thorne, Jr., the reluctant heir, gave a slight bow and walked out, leaving the courthouse and the protection of the law to face the inevitable violent fury of his father. Elijah picked up the keepsake and the original patent. He was bruised, exhausted, and temporarily safe. He had a 2-week window, a fragile truce bought by the Trust's own disillusioned son. He knew the true battle was just beginning, and he had to return to the valley, not as a courier, but as a leader, ready to rally the community for the final showdown against the Copper Creek Trust. The stakes were no longer just the manse, but the soul of the Cimarron Valley.
River of Hope. Final stand at the Sentinel Rock. 1. The hammer falls. Retaliation of the architect. Senator Cyrus Thorne did not merely receive the news of Judge Merritt's injunction, he absorbed it like a thunderbolt, translating judicial setback instantly into political acceleration. The stay on the foreclosure and the mandated 2-week survey were not obstacles to him. They were merely irritations confirming that the legal system, when followed by the weak, his son, was too slow. The confrontation with Samuel Thorne Jr. had been swift, devastating, and entirely private, held in the senator's mahogany-lined office in Denver. "You choked on your own conscience, Samuel," Cyrus Thorne had roared, his voice low and vibrating with cold fury. "You used your mother's ghost to validate a century-old clerical error. You traded a billion-dollar legacy for 2 weeks of moral high ground. You are not a Thorne. You are dismissed, exiled. You will not inherit so much as a shadow." Samuel had merely stood, silent, finally free of the burden of the trust, now embracing the title of the Ghost, a man who had killed his own past. He left Denver that night, disappearing east, taking only the weight of his actions. With Samuel gone, Cyrus Thorne unleashed his true architect of ruin: speed, brute force, and political immunity. He knew Elijah Vance would struggle to find a neutral surveyor within the short time frame, but Thorne wasn't waiting for the court's process. "Riker," Thorne commanded, addressing his chief enforcer, Marcus Riker, who now wore the badge of the Copper Creek Trust's head of security, replacing Samuel in the hierarchy of destruction.
The enabling act for the new Cimarron Reservoir was signed by the governor this morning. The law is now on our side regardless of the Vance boundary dispute. We do not need the water rights from the Sentinel Rock. We only need to secure the construction site above the main dam line. We start earth moving tomorrow at dawn. The moment the first shovel hits the dirt on the new reservoir site, the court's jurisdiction becomes irrelevant. It's now a public works project protected by the state. The plan was simple and ruthless. Make the destruction a fait accompli. By the time the court-appointed surveyor arrived, the Seminar Valley's hydrology would be permanently altered by the sheer scope of the construction. Riker understood. The fight had left the courthouse and moved to the dusty, high desert canyon where the trust planned to choke the river. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the silence of the Seminar Canyon was shattered. Thorne had mobilized a small army of heavy equipment, steam shovels, dozens of teams of blasting experts, and a formidable escort of armed guards. The architect of ruin was building his monument to monopoly. Weaving the counter-narrative. Elijah Vance rode back to the Seminar Valley like a ghost himself, covered in dust, energized only by adrenaline and the fragile hope of the 2-week stay. He found the community galvanized by the news of the injunction, but terrified by the constant, looming presence of the trust's impending construction. At the community hall, under the flickering lamplight, Elijah showed them the court order. This is not a victory. It is a timeout. Thorne is already moving equipment into the upper canyon for the main reservoir. He's betting we can't find a legitimate surveyor in time. He's betting we'll stand here and argue while he destroys the source of the river. He held up the mother's keepsake. This journal is the key. My mother, before she died, she knew a scientist, not a corporate hack, but a true pioneer of hydrology, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Hayes. She worked on the original geological survey of the region before Thorne bought up all the state assets. She's the only one who can validate the 1888 patent against Thorne's entire corporate machine. Finding Dr. Hayes was the next great ride. The journal entry hinted at her last known location, a remote, forgotten research station in the High Rockies, where she had been effectively blacklisted by Thorne years ago for refusing to approve a previous mining operation. She was the one true weaver of hope, the person who could turn an old piece of parchment into scientifically validated truth. Elijah rode north immediately, leaving the manse in the care of his childhood friend, Sarah, who promised to mobilize a small, peaceful vigil at the Sentinel Rock to monitor the canyon construction. He found Dr. Hayes near the Continental Divide, living in a rough-hewn, isolated cabin surrounded by geological samples and stacks of books. She was a woman in her late 40s, sharp-featured, with hands stained permanently by rock dust and ink. When Elijah presented the keepsake and explained his desperate plight, she did not immediately agree. "Thorne ruined me, Vance," she said, running a finger over the compass rose drawn on the cover of the keepsake. "He called me a hysterical amateur and buried my research under a mountain of his own commissioned reports. If I go down there again, he'll do worse." "He's already destroying the seminar," Elijah argued, his voice ragged. "He's banking on the 1905 boundary being enough. My mother's map, your friend's drawing, it shows the Sentinel Rock isn't just a rock, it's a shield." Dr. Hayes finally looked up, a flicker of professional intensity replacing the weariness in her eyes. "It's the cap rock," she breathed. "The Sentinel Rock is the shale cap of a hydrostatic basin. It holds the pressure of the deep aquifer. If Thorne breaches that cap rock, the entire Seminar Valley's water table will drop 20 feet. It won't just divert the river, it will dry up every single well on the valley floor. It will turn the Seminar into the Salt Lick Divide."
This was the core of the catastrophe. Thorne wasn't just stealing water, he was permanently destroying the land's ability to hold water. This was the true destructive intent of the architect of ruin. Dr. Hayes agreed. She returned with Elijah, traveling in secrecy, carrying not corporate reports, but a small, specialized seismograph and a collection of hand-drawn cross-sections. She was the weaver of hope, the one who could translate the ancient rhythm of the earth into a modern, undeniable truth. They spent 3 frantic days working at the Sentinel Rock, barely 2 miles from where Riker and the Trust's construction crews were already dynamiting the Upper Canyon. Dr. Hayes used the old 1888 patent boundaries as her guide, using specialized instruments to measure the subterranean pressure points. Her findings were conclusive. The 1888 boundary was scientifically correct, and Thorne's new diversion plans were pointed precisely at the hydrostatic caprock. The 2-week injunction expired at noon on a Friday. The court-appointed surveyor, a slow, methodical man, had barely finished mapping the surface boundaries. But Elijah and Dr. Hayes had the scientific truth, validated by the original, accurate notes found in the keepsake. Cyrus Thorne didn't wait for the surveyor's report. He arranged a public spectacle at the construction site in the Upper Canyon. The governor, heavily indebted to Thorne, was flying in to ceremonially break ground on the Cimarron Public Works Reservoir. Elijah, Dr. Hayes, and the people of the Cimarron Valley, the Weavers of Hope, arrived en masse. They stood on the highest, safest ridge overlooking the canyon. Below them, a great crowd had gathered, reporters from the territorial capital, Thorne's armed guards, his engineers, and the makeshift stage where the governor was due to speak. Elijah stepped forward, the keepsake, and Dr. Hayes's final conclusive geological report in his hands. He was no longer the courier. He was the voice of the valley. "Senator Thorne!" Elijah's voice boomed across the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics. "The injunction period has ended. We have the final scientific proof. The 1888 Protectorate Site Clause is valid." The crowds turned to look up at the ridge. Cyrus Thorne, standing imperiously on the platform, squinted up at Elijah. He saw not just a farmer, but a threat to his entire empire. He signaled Riker. "Vance is trespassing on private federally enabled land. He is obstructing a public works project. Guards, remove them." Riker and a line of heavily armed Trust security began marching toward the ridge. Dr. Hayes stepped next to Elijah, holding up a simplified, color-coded geological diagram. "The governor is being misled!" Dr. Hayes yelled, addressing the press corps below. "Senator Thorne's reservoir plant is not for water storage. It is designed to breach the Sentinel Rock caprock. If that cap is broken, the Cimarron Valley's aquifer collapses. This is not progress. It is environmental devastation that will dry up every town, every farm for 100 miles. Thorne tried to silence her, but the reporters were scrambling, suddenly focused on the catastrophic nature of the claim. Elijah then walked to the edge of the ridge, his eyes locked on Thorne. He opened the keepsake to the final page. Not a map, but a contract. "Senator Thorne," Elijah announced, his voice ringing with redemptive power, "you called this a fight over $900. It's a fight over a broken promise. This is a partnership agreement signed by you and my grandfather, Silas Vance, in 1891. The agreement states that in exchange for Silas's financial support for your first rail line, you would forever uphold the Protectorate Site Clause, safeguarding the water for the community. The $900 of debt was merely a tool of your betrayal, Cyrus. The architect of ruin built his empire on a lie." The crowd gasped.
The fight was no longer about an abstract boundary. It was about the personal, fundamental betrayal of the new world's hopeful dream. Thorn, for the first time, looked shaken. His entire public persona was built on being the upstanding pioneer. As Riker and his men reached the ridge, Dr. Hayes had one final creative tool. She had set small, sensitive seismic monitors in the loose shale of the ridge. The rhythmic pounding of Thorne's distant steam shovels was registering. "Senator Thorne, you are currently drilling into the hydrostatic tension zone," Dr. Hayes shouted. "The pressure is unstable. If you continue, you risk a catastrophic man-made fissure right now." The redemptive force was the collective will and the undeniable science of the land. The governor, realizing the PR disaster and the genuine threat of an ecological meltdown, waved frantically to Thorne. Thorne looked at the seismic readings Dr. Hayes held up, at the final, damning page of the old contract, and at the faces of the Cimarron people, the weavers of hope, who stood together, armed only with the truth. He saw his dream of absolute control crumble. The destruction he had engineered was met by a creative, unified force that understood the land better than his balance sheet. "Stop the equipment!" Thorne finally roared, defeated not by law, but by public exposure and the irreversible science of the land. The deafening roar of the steam shovels and the hiss of the machinery slowly died down. A profound silence fell over the canyon. The architect of ruin had been halted. His hammer dropped. The Cimarron Valley was saved. The court-appointed surveyor, guided by Dr. Hayes' conclusive report, formalized the 1888 boundaries. The Sentinel Rock was permanently protected, ensuring the river would flow and the wells would remain full. Elijah, standing beside Dr. Hayes, looked down on the peaceful valley. The manse was safe, the water was secure, and the community had found its voice. The keepsake, the relic of the past, had become the blueprint for the future. The ballad of the New World ghost had ended, replaced by the symphony of a community's renewed hope.
The silence of the solstice. The Cimarron Valley was not silent. It had simply replaced the deafening roar of Thorne's earth-moving equipment with the softer, more honest sounds of its own life. The steady rush of the river, the creak of old porch swings, and the distant metallic clang from Ezra's forge. But in the grand, decaying husk of the old Copper Creek factory, the epicenter of Senator Thorne's attempted destruction, a profound, almost sacred silence had settled. Elijah Vance stood in the center of the vast, empty floor. It was 2 months after the final stand at Sentinel Rock. 2 months since Cyrus Thorne was publicly humiliated, the injunction made permanent, and the Cimarron Protectorate site legally affirmed. The factory floor was where Thorne had planned to house the massive pumps and pipelines that would have diverted the Cimarron River into the new, unnecessary reservoir, leaving the valley bone dry. The industrial space was immense, a cathedral built for greed, with concrete pillars stretching up into the gloom and grime-coated windows that let in weak winter light. Elijah was here not to gloat, but to inventory. The trust had abandoned the factory, leaving behind only the ghosts of ambition, scattered tools, empty drums of oil, and, most tellingly, a vast, unfinished concrete basin where the main pumps were supposed to sit. It was a massive footprint of what almost was. What had they gained? The immediate answer was the land. The Sentinel Rock stood unbreached, its protective cap rock intact. The Cimarron River flowed, the lifeblood of the valley secured for generations. Legally, the 1888 patent had been fully ratified in a landmark environmental ruling, setting a precedent that other communities across the West were already citing in their own battles against corporate overreach. But the real gain, Elijah reflected, was standing right beside him. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the once blacklisted hydrologist, now wore a heavy canvas coat and a triumphant expression. She was no longer just a scientist, she was a hero. The court had recognized her original suppressed research, validating not just the boundary, but her entire career. She was the one who had finally given the people of Cimarron the vocabulary to defend themselves, the language of hydrostatic pressure, caprock integrity, and aquifer resilience. It's a magnificent space in a terrifying way, Dr. Hayes commented, running her hand over a cold steel beam. It represents the scale of the fight. Thorn didn't want water, Elijah. He wanted control over the potential of water. He wanted to own the future. He lost that future, Elijah replied, picking up a rusted wrench. But the loss came at a cost greater than his reputation. The greatest loss had been subtle, personal, and internal, the dissolution of families and the shedding of illusions. Elijah looked at his hands, calloused not just from farm work, but from the emotional strain of the battle. The keepsake, the physical proof of Thorn's betrayal and the catalyst for the entire conflict, was now secured in a bank vault, copied, scanned, and filed with the court as evidence. It was an artifact of history, no longer a daily comfort. His relationship with his own past was fractured. He had spent years clinging to the guilt of his mother's death and the burden of the manse. Now he was free of both, yet adrift. The manse was simply a house now, secured but empty of the central narrative that had defined his life. He walked toward a dark corner of the factory where a small, rough-hewn wooden shelf had been hastily installed during the construction phase. On it, someone had etched a name: S. Thorn, Jr. Samuel Thorn, the New World ghost, was the most profound personal loss. After turning against his father and providing the crucial legal delay, Samuel had vanished. He was officially disinherited, disowned, and exiled. Elijah had searched for him, wanting to reconcile the fierce loyalty he felt for the man who had risked everything to do the right thing, and the bitterness he held for the years of complicity. He found nothing but rumors, a brief sighting in Seattle, a letter sent to a pro bono law firm in Boston. Samuel had destroyed his own life to save Cimarron. It was an act of terrible, necessary redemption. "You've been looking for him, haven't you?" Dr. Hayes asked softly, reading the tension in Elijah's shoulders. "He's out there somewhere, a lawyer with no law to practice, a son with no family to inherit. He paid the ultimate price for his conscience." "He gained something too," Dr. Hayes countered. "He gained a clean slate, a true conscience. That's an expensive gift in this world." Their reflections were interrupted by Sarah, Elijah's childhood friend and staunch ally, who burst into the factory, her breath steaming in the cold air. "Ezra needs help at the forge," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "The new well pumps for the valley are ready for their final fittings, and, oh, this just came in the mail." She handed Elijah a thin, unmarked envelope with no return address. It contained only 2 words, typewritten: "The architect rests." Elijah understood immediately. Thorn had stepped down, publicly citing health reasons, but everyone knew the real reason. The humiliation of the Cimarron judgment had been too heavy a stone for his empire to carry. Thorn's influence was waning. His projects were collapsing under regulatory review, and the legal precedent set by Cimarron was proving toxic to his corporate practices. The architect of ruin was no longer building, he was dismantling.
3. The weaving of the future. If the architect of ruin was resting, the weavers of hope were just beginning their work. The old Copper Creek factory, the symbol of impending doom, now stood as the largest, emptiest space in the entire valley. The question became, what do you do with the cathedral of abandoned greed? The community hall, packed with locals, became the new center of the valley's life. Sarah, leading the discussion, stood before the crowd, sketching ideas on a chalkboard. "We have the land, we have the water, and we have this giant building," Sarah declared, chalk dust settling on her dark hair. "We defeated the architect's plan. Now we have to build our own.
What does Cimarron need most? The immediate answers were predictable. A proper irrigation cooperative, a clinic, a place for the children to learn trades. Dr. Hayes, sitting in the front row, cleared her throat. What you have here is a chance to define your own future using the very science that saved you. This building is vast. We can turn it into a center for ecological farming research. We can study the impact of the protected water source, develop climate-resilient crops, and teach others how to balance industry with nature. We could call it the Sentinel Institute. The idea electrified the room. It was not just about restoration, it was about defining a new economy based on the principles they had fought for. The factory floor, once destined for pumps that stole water, would now house laboratories that nurtured it. Elijah was tasked with leading the renovation. He knew the building inside and out. He had studied Thorne's plans and walked the ground for years. His purpose, which had been lost when the keepsake's narrative ended, was now concrete and immediate. The next day, the factory floor was not filled with the roar of heavy machinery, but with the measured sounds of constructive effort. Carpenters hammering, electricians running new lines, and Elijah, with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since childhood, overseeing the placement of the first foundation stone for the new laboratory. 4. An echo of the past, a whisper of peace. Weeks passed, marked by the slow, difficult process of creation. The conversion was immense, requiring cooperation and sacrifice from everyone in the valley. One afternoon, as the winter deepened, Elijah found a small, locked metal chest hidden beneath the floorboards in the senator's old makeshift executive office inside the factory. He broke the lock and opened it. Inside was not gold or deeds, but a collection of personal items. A small, faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes, Thorne's late wife, Samuel's mother. A silver locket, and a series of letters tied with a thin, brittle ribbon. The letters were from Samuel's mother, written to Thorne early in their marriage, filled with earnest pleas for him to honor the spirit of the protectorate and not just the letter of the law. They revealed a side of Thorne that had been lost, a man who once loved deeply, whose wife was the source of his brief early morality. The letters were filled with sorrowful warnings about the danger of prioritizing profit over the health of the land, warnings Thorne had ignored until they became the foundation of his ruin. Elijah read them all, understanding that the ghost's mother had tried to be the weaver of hope for her husband and failed. It was the essential conflict that had played out on the Sentinel Rock. He sealed the letters and mailed the chest, anonymously, to a law firm in Seattle, the place where Samuel was rumored to be. It was the only closure he could offer the ghost. 5. The Reckoning on the Ridge. On the day of the spring thaw, the Sentinel Institute was nearing completion. The valley had hosted journalists, environmentalists, and lawyers from across the country, all wanting to see the place where the tide had turned. Elijah stood alone on the ridge overlooking the Sentinel Rock. The river below was swollen with meltwater, powerful but controlled. A solitary figure appeared on the path behind him. He wore the rough clothes of a traveler, but carried himself with the posture of an educated man. "You always did have a better view from up here, Vance," his voice quiet. Elijah turned. It was Samuel Thorne. The ghost had returned. "Samuel," Elijah greeted him, neither surprised nor immediately welcoming. The weight of what had passed between them, betrayal, rescue, self-destruction, was too heavy for a simple reunion. "My father is in Florida. He's ill. The business is being restructured. The trust It's going to be a water utility, nothing more. A necessary evil, but no longer an architect of ruin. You did that, Elijah. You stopped him. No, Samuel corrected. I merely pulled the trigger on the timeline. You and the others, Dr. Hayes, Sarah, Ezra, you are the ones who prepared the soil. You had the truth and you learned how to weave it into a weapon. Samuel looked at the sentinel rock. I saw the chest, the letters from my mother. I understood then what I was truly fighting for. Not against my father, but for the moral core he forfeited. Elijah finally extended his hand. The Sentinel Institute is almost ready. We need a director of community outreach, someone who understands both the law and the human cost of these battles. Samuel smiled a genuine, unburdened smile that Elijah had never seen on him before. I'm not a lawyer anymore, Elijah. I'm just a man with a lot of heavy luggage I'm trying to unpack. Then unpack it here, Elijah said. This is the place built on the moral core you saved. Samuel stood beside him, breathing the clean, high desert air. The shadows of the past, the debt, the keepsake, the feud were receding. The old factory, once a symbol of ruin, was now transforming into the Sentinel Institute, a testament to resilience and creative hope. The quiet, empty floor was now filled with the echoes of a future they would build together, a testament to the enduring American ideal that collective creativity could always overcome concentrated greed.
Where the river meets the sea, a final confluence. 1. The deep current of 10 years. 10 years, a decade, is a geologic measurement when you're talking about the Cimarron Valley, a stretch of time barely registering on the face of Sentinel Rock, yet long enough to carve an entirely new course for the people living in its shadow. The silence that had settled upon the old Copper Creek factory was gone, replaced by the purposeful hum of the Sentinel Institute. The vast, vaulted floor, once designed to house the tools of corporate plunder, now echoed with the focused sounds of environmental resilience. The quiet drone of hydroponic systems, the rhythmic clack of 3D printers, fabricating specialized drought-resistant irrigation nozzles, and the animated voices of students gathered in what was now the Hall of Governance. Elijah Vance stood on the balcony overlooking the main floor, his hands resting on the cool, repurposed steel railing. His hair held more silver now, and his face was etched with lines of experience, but his eyes, the deep, watchful eyes of a man who understood the language of the land, were brighter. He was no longer the reluctant guardian burdened by an ancient secret. He was the chief agricultural liaison, responsible for translating the Institute's high-tech solutions into practical applications for the Valley's farmers. Below him, the Institute was a testament to the hard-won victory. They hadn't just preserved the land, they had revitalized the economy. The small family farms, once fragile and dependent on external markets, were now part of the Cimarron Cooperative, supplying specialty heritage crops and sustainable beef to major metropolitan areas. They were thriving because their resource, the water, was secured, managed, and respected. Elijah's gaze settled on a figure across the hall, leading a tour of visiting legal scholars from the East Coast. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, now Dr. Vance, wore a tailored gray suit that somehow still conveyed her characteristic academic urgency. She was the Institute's Director of Research, a figure of national repute in water law and hydrology. She taught, consulted, and traveled, turning the Cimarron precedent into a boilerplate defense for threatened communities across the country. Their life together was the quiet, profound peace of two rivers that had finally merged. There was no more tension, only the shared purpose
of building the future they had fought so hard to secure. 2. The architect of renewal. The tour group paused near the massive wall-mounted plaque detailing the history of the 1888 patent. A tall man with reserved manners and an air of quiet authority stepped forward to address the scholars. This was Samuel Thorne. The New World ghost had found a new body, not of law, but of ethical administration. He was the executive director of the Sentinel Institute. When he returned to the valley a decade ago, he hadn't sought forgiveness, he had sought work. And the work was transformative. The initial phase of the conflict was a textbook case of corporate capture of political power, Samuel explained to the visiting group, his voice measured. My father, Senator Thorne, believed he could simply buy the water, and therefore the future. The crucial turning point, however, was not the legal one, but the moral one. The people of Cimarron understood that some things, a river, a community's legacy, are not for sale. We secured the injunction, we won the appeals, and the land was protected. But the Institute's purpose is to ensure that the victory is never just a static legal document, but a living, dynamic model of sustainability. Samuel was Cimarron's architect of renewal. He used his insider knowledge of finance and large-scale project management to design a non-profit structure that was as robust as the Sentinel Rock. He ensured the Institute's endowments were shielded, its research was unbiased, and its mission remained focused on the community first. He was quiet, unassuming, and universally respected. He had fully paid the price of his conscience, earning back his name through service. Elijah walked down to meet Eleanor as the tour group dispersed. Thorne was flawless today, Eleanor commented, adjusting her glasses. He makes the fight sound so clinical. He never mentions the death threats, the sabotage, or the sheer terror of that last night at the Rock. He doesn't have to, Elijah murmured, kissing her forehead. We remember. That's what matters. Besides, he's found his peace in the paperwork. The ghost is finally home, even if he doesn't know what to call this place. He calls it essential, Eleanor replied, which, coming from him, is high praise. 3. The forge and the fiber. The most tangible evidence of the valley's rebirth was found a mile down the river, where Esri's old forge had been expanded to the Cimarron Trades Cooperative. Sarah, now the co-op's administrator and a formidable political force in the county, greeted them. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, hot steel, and the clean, sharp smell of newly milled lumber. We just finished the new run of the Sentinel siphon pumps. 20% lighter than the last batch, and the pressure seals are holding beautifully in the stress test. Ezra's a genius. Ezra, still the heart of the operation, emerged from the smoke-filled smithy, his biceps corded, his face ruddy with heat and pride. It's not genius, Sarah. It's geometry, Ezra corrected gruffly. Thorne's plan was built on brute force and unsustainable extraction. We're building tools based on necessity and efficiency. We don't need to dominate the river. We need to cooperate with it. The co-op wasn't just a place to fix tractors. It was an incubator for valley-based technology. They developed small-scale, solar-powered filtration units, designed specialized tools for Elijah's regenerative agriculture plots, and most recently, secured a major contract with the state parks department to fabricate custom, low-impact trail infrastructure. The greatest gain wasn't the land, Elijah, Sarah said, leaning against a workbench covered in tools. It was self-determination. For years, we were a valley of survivors. Now, we're a valley of creators. We control our output, our narrative, and our wealth. We are financially independent of the systems that tried to consume us. Elijah smiled.
picking up a newly forged hand trowel. And you finally got high-speed fiber internet, Sarah. Don't forget that crucial gain. Sarah laughed. The fiber was essential. How else can we manage global supply chains from the middle of nowhere? We learned the hard way. You can't defeat the global machine with local stubbornness alone. You have to beat it at its own game, with better science, better law, and better technology.
4. The manse's transformation. Their small home life was contained within the manse, but the structure itself had undergone a profound transformation. The grand old house, once a suffocating museum of Elijah's family legacy and loss, was now the Cimarron Archive and Community Library. The formal drawing room, where Elijah had discovered the keepsake and the hidden truth, was now the main reading room, filled with high shelves of books, research papers, and the detailed records of the Cimarron legal defense. The keepsake itself, the leather-bound journal that had served as the key to the entire conflict, was kept in a climate-controlled display case in the center of the room. It was protected not by a fortress, but by transparency. Anyone could read its copied pages, understand the betrayal, and grasp the price of vigilance. Elijah and Eleanor lived in a modest, newly built annex behind the main house, a space that was airy, functional, and uncluttered by history. Their peace was based on absence, the absence of secrets, the absence of crushing debt, and the absence of ghosts. One evening, looking through the windows of the reading room at the distant floodlit Sentinel Rock, Elijah confessed a quiet fear to Eleanor. "I worry sometimes that the peace is just temporary, that the next thorn is already planning his attack, that we're resting on laurels too thin to support the weight of the future." Eleanor turned from her laptop, which was open to a complex hydrological model of the valley's aquifer recharge rate. She walked over and placed a hand on the keepsake display case. "The victory wasn't about defeating Thorn, Elijah. It was about defining the Cimarron identity. We learned how to fight, how to organize, and how to govern ourselves independently. The system is no longer reliant on one person's sacrifice or one hidden secret. We codified the defense in the institute, in the co-op, in the law. We are resilient because the knowledge is decentralized." She smiled. "The victory is now woven into the fiber optic cables, the new building codes, and the curriculum we teach to visiting environmental lawyers. That kind of peace isn't temporary, it's structural." The journey to the salt water. The true symbolic end of their journey came not in the valley, but 300 miles west on the Pacific coast. Elijah and Eleanor had taken a week off to celebrate their 10th anniversary, 10 years of shared life and shared victory. Their destination was the estuary where the Cimarron River, after its long, meandering journey, finally emptied into the Pacific Ocean. The journey was a pilgrimage. They drove through the canyons and deserts, seeing the sister rivers and streams that were now benefiting from the Cimarron precedent. They saw new solar farms replacing coal pits and communities holding annual festivals to celebrate their own successful land trusts. Finally, they reached the coastal town. The Cimarron River, greatly widened now, flowed into a large biodiverse estuary, mixing its cold, clear mountain water with the warm, shifting tides of the Pacific. They stood on the sandy bank, watching the slow, powerful confluence. The river water, having survived the threat of diversion and pollution, now poured its clean, vital essence into the enormousness of the sea. "It's done it," Elijah whispered, a profound sense of finality washing over him. "It made it all the way. It flows into everything." Eleanor took his hand. "That's what our fight was, Elijah. We weren't fighting for Cimarron alone. We were fighting for the purity of this single clean contribution to the whole system. The sea doesn't care about our local drama, our keepsake, or Thorn's greed. It only cares about the quality of the water we send it." Elijah stared at the meeting point. For years, his world had been defined by the high, dry, isolated mountains, the source of the water, the source of the secret. His life was about guarding the headwaters. Now he saw the end point, the vast, limitless ocean, indifferent to their struggle, but dependent on their success.
This is the new beginning, he realized, turning the phrase over in his mind. It's not just about protecting the local, it's about participating in the global. The Cimarron flows into the sea, and the law we made there flows into every courtroom that defends a small community. They stayed until the sun dropped below the Pacific horizon, the light painting the water in deep, bruised purples and golds. Later, sitting on a bench overlooking the rolling waves, Elijah opened his bag and pulled out a small, heavy object. It wasn't the keepsake, but a small, polished segment of dark gray caprock chipped from Sentinel Rock after the court victory. He tossed it on the sand, far below the reach of the tide. "What was that for?" Eleanor asked. "It's time to stop holding on to the stones of the past," he simply said. "The legacy isn't in the relics, it's in the current." The ultimate peace was recognizing that the finality they sought was not an endpoint, but a perpetual cycle. The river would always flow, and there would always be new storms on the horizon. But now, the Cimarron Valley was ready for the high tide. They had gained everything, not just the land, but a future free from the dictates of others. They had lost the heavy, confining myths of the past, the weight of guilt, and the dangerous naivete about corporate power. Their new beginning was the Sentinel Institute, the thriving co-op, the archive in the manse, and the quiet joy of their life together. It was a victory measured not in headlines, but in the sustained, clean flow of water that now fed the sea. As the tide rolled in, the salt wind carrying the scent of a vast shared world, Elijah knew that the work of guarding the headwaters had created a legacy that would now mingle with the infinite, carried forever on the global current.